Hello, everyone. Welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight, we bring you 8 deeply unsettling testimonies from the Tennessee Appalachian Mountains, where old darkness still walks the hollows and ridges. The Smokies and their surrounding wilderness have swallowed secrets for centuries, and the people who live in these remote valleys know things the rest of us were never meant to learn. These are stories sent to us by people who encountered something out there in those ancient hills, something that doesn't belong in any guidebook or travel brochure. Disappearances that make no sense, rituals that predate the settlements, voices that echo from caves that shouldn't exist, and families who've been keeping watch over things that should have stayed buried. These accounts come from truck drivers, hikers, forest workers, and people who simply took the wrong road at the wrong time. If you've ever driven through the Appalachian backroads of Tennessee after sunset, you might understand why these people can never quite forget what they saw. So settle in, turn down the lights, and listen carefully, because once you hear these stories, you might never look at those mountains the same way again.
This happened in October of 2016 when I was 31 years old. My name is Aaron and I'm originally from Knoxville, Tennessee, though I've since moved to North Carolina as far from the Smokies as I could manage while still staying in the region. I was working as a long-haul trucker at the time, running routes that took me through the mountains several times a month. The company I worked for specialized in deliveries to the more remote communities scattered throughout the Tennessee Appalachians, places where the roads got narrow and the cell service disappeared for hours at a time. The route I'm going to tell you about was one I'd driven maybe 15 or 20 times before without incident. It ran from Knoxville up through Sevier County, then cut east into some of the less traveled areas near the North Carolina border. Small towns with names like Cosby, Hartford, and Del Rio. Communities that time seemed to have left behind, where the same families had lived for generations, and outsiders were noticed immediately. On this particular run, I was hauling building supplies to a lumber operation outside a place called Greenbrier. The load wasn't particularly heavy, and I'd made the delivery countless times. I left Knoxville around 4 in the afternoon, planning to make the delivery before dark and then head back. It was one of those perfect autumn days in East Tennessee, with the leaves at peak color and the air crisp enough that you could feel winter waiting just beyond the next ridge. The first hour went exactly as planned. I took Highway 321 up through Gatlinburg, passing all the tourist traffic heading into the Smokies. Once I got past the main park entrance, the crowds thinned out considerably. The road narrowed, the trees pressed in closer, and civilization started to feel like something temporary, something the mountains had merely tolerated for a little while. I turned off onto Route 32, following it deeper into the backcountry. This was where things always got interesting. The road twisted through valleys so narrow you could barely see the sky, crossing old steel bridges that rattled under the truck's weight. The communities out here were different from the tourist towns. No welcome signs, no craft shops or pancake houses, just weathered houses tucked into the hillsides, old churches with hand-painted signs, and the occasional gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. I stopped at one of those gas stations around 5:30, a place called Redmond's that sat at a crossroads about 20 miles from my destination. I needed to use the bathroom and grab a coffee for the return trip. The station was one of those places that sold a little bit of everything: gas, groceries, hardware, bait. The kind of place that served as a community hub in areas where the nearest Walmart was an hour away. There was an old man behind the counter, probably in his 70s, with the deep-set eyes and weathered face you see in people who've spent their entire lives in these mountains. I paid for my coffee and asked him about the road ahead, just making conversation. "You headed to Greenbrier?" he asked, his accent thick with that distinctive East Tennessee mountain drawl. "Yes, sir," I said, making a delivery to Ashford Lumber. He nodded slowly, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You been up there before?" "Many times," I told him. "Probably my 20th run." "Well?" he said, and there was a long pause. "You be careful on that stretch between here and there, especially once you get past Miller's Gap." I'd driven past Miller's Gap dozens of times. It was just a wide spot in the road with an old covered bridge, nothing remarkable. "Something wrong with the road?" I asked. "Road's fine," he said. "It's what's alongside it you want to watch for." This was the kind of vague warning you sometimes got in rural areas, and I'd learned not to press too hard. People either told you what they meant, or they didn't. I thanked him, grabbed my coffee, and headed back to the truck. The sun was starting to sink behind the ridgeline as I pulled back onto Route 32. The shadows in the valleys had gone deep purple, and the temperature was dropping fast. I turned on my headlights, even though it wasn't quite dark yet. Something about that old man's warning had put a slight edge on my mood, though I couldn't have said exactly why. Miller's Gap came up about 15 minutes later. The covered bridge was exactly where it always was, its dark wooden tunnel lit red by my taillights as I passed through. The road on the other side climbed steeply, switchbacking up the mountainside through dense forest. This was one of the more isolated stretches, where you might not see another vehicle for half an hour. About 2 miles past the bridge, I saw something in the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. The shape was roughly the right size, standing maybe 50 yards ahead in the middle of my lane. I eased off the gas and put my hand on the horn, ready to give a short blast to scare it off. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't moving like a deer. It was completely still, not reacting to my headlights at all. When I got within 30 yards, my headlights fully illuminated it, and I felt my stomach drop. It was a person, or at least, it had the shape of a person. It stood in the middle of the road facing my truck, arms at its sides, completely motionless. I couldn't make out any details of its face or clothing because it was entirely in silhouette against my headlights, just a black, human-shaped cutout. I hit the brakes, bringing the truck to a complete stop about 20 feet away. My first thought was that someone needed help, that this was an accident victim or a stranded hiker. I put the truck in park and reached for my door handle, but something stopped me. The figure hadn't moved at all, not even the slight sway you'd expect from someone standing in the cold wind that was blowing down the mountain. It stood perfectly, impossibly still. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, my hand on the door handle, trying to decide what to do. The road was too narrow to go around it. The drop-off on the right side was steep enough to be dangerous, and the left side was a wall of rock. I'd have to back up or convince this person to move. I put my hand on the horn and gave it 3 short blasts. The figure didn't react. It just stood there, that black silhouette in my headlights, not moving, not acknowledging the truck at all. A cold feeling was starting to build in my chest. This wasn't right. Even if this was someone in shock, even if they were injured or disoriented, they would have reacted to the horn. But this thing, and I was starting to think of it as a thing rather than a person, remained absolutely motionless. I put the truck in reverse and started backing up slowly, intending to turn around and find another route. But as soon as I started moving backward, the figure moved too. It walked toward the truck, not ran, walked, but its movement was wrong. The gait was too smooth, too gliding. It covered the distance between us faster than a walk should allow, and within seconds, it was only a few feet from my front bumper. I stopped backing up and stared at it through the windshield. Now that it was closer, I could see more details, and I wish I couldn't. It had the outline of a person, definitely. But where its face should have been, there was just smooth darkness. No features, no variation in the shadow. Its arms were too long, hanging past its knees, and its proportions were wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Too tall and too thin and too angular. It stood there in front of my truck, that featureless face aimed directly at me through the windshield. Then it raised one of those 2 long arms and pointed at something off to the left side of the road. I didn't want to look. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to just gun the engine and drive straight through this thing, or to keep backing up until I could turn around. But some horrible fascination made me turn my head and look where it was pointing. At first, I didn't see anything except the rock wall and the trees above it. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw the gap. There was an opening in the rock face, partly hidden by vegetation. It looked like the entrance to a cave or maybe an old mine shaft. But what made my blood run cold was that there were lights inside it. Not electric lights. These were flickering and orange, like torches or fires, and they were moving. As I watched, something moved in that opening. Another figure, then another. They were too far away and too deep in shadow for me to make out details, but they were definitely humanoid, and they were moving in a way that suggested they were doing something, working at something, or performing something. The figure in front of my truck was still pointing, still motionless except for that raised arm. I looked back at it and felt my hand start shaking on the steering wheel, because now I could see that its head was slowly tilting to the side. That smooth, featureless face still aimed at me, tilting further and further until it was nearly perpendicular to its shoulders. No human neck could bend that way. I made my decision. I threw the truck into drive, gripped the steering wheel hard, and slammed my foot down on the gas. The engine roared and the truck lurched forward. The figure didn't move. I was sure I was going to hit it, sure I was going to feel the impact and hear whatever sound this thing would make. But at the last possible second, it simply wasn't there anymore. It didn't jump out of the way or fall or get knocked aside. It just ceased to be in front of my truck. I didn't slow down. I kept my foot pressed to the floor, pushing the truck as fast as I dared on that winding mountain road. My headlights swept across the trees and rock faces, and I kept expecting to see more of those figures. Kept expecting something to step out in front of me again. It took me another 20 minutes to reach the lumber operation. By the time I pulled into their lot, I was drenched in sweat despite the cold. The manager came out to meet me, surprised that I was so late. I didn't tell him what had happened. I just said I'd had to slow down for deer, which was a common enough occurrence that he didn't question it. I made the delivery, got the paperwork signed, and faced a decision. The most direct route back to Knoxville meant retracing my path through that same stretch of road. The alternative would add almost 3 hours to my return trip, taking me up through Virginia and then back down. But the thought of driving past that spot again, especially now that it was fully dark, made my hands shake. I took the long way. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen for several weeks. Who would believe it? But the image of that figure, that smooth nothing where a face should have been, kept replaying in my mind. And the cave opening with the moving lights. And the other figures inside. About a month later, I was having a beer with another driver who worked the same routes. I'd had a few drinks, enough to lower my guard, and I mentioned that I'd seen something strange on Route 32 near Miller's Gap. I kept it vague, just said I'd seen someone standing in the road who'd looked wrong somehow. His expression changed immediately. He leaned in close and asked me exactly where, and when I told him, he nodded slowly. "You're not the first," he said. "There have been others. Drivers mostly, but also some hikers and hunters. Nobody talks about it much because, well, who's going to believe you? But there's something in those hills around Miller's Gap. Something old. He told me that the locals in that area, the ones whose families had been there for generations, they knew about it. They had stories that went back 100 years or more. Stories about something that lived in the deep places under the mountains. Something that had been there long before the first settlers arrived. The Cherokee had stories about it too, apparently. About spirits that walked the gaps and hollows, looking for people to take back into the earth. The cave I'd seen, he said, that was one of the entrances. There were others scattered throughout that region, hidden openings that led down into a network of caverns that ran for miles under the mountains. And sometimes, whatever lived down there came up to the surface, usually at dusk or dawn, those in-between times. And they marked people, pointed them out, selected them. For what? I asked. He just shook his head. Nobody who gets taken comes back to tell. I wanted to dismiss it as mountain superstition, the kind of folklore that grows up in isolated communities. But I couldn't forget what I'd seen, that impossible stillness, that head tilting at an angle that would have broken a human neck, the way it had simply vanished when my truck should have hit it. I requested a route change the next week. My supervisor wasn't happy about it, but I told him I had family issues that made the eastern routes difficult. He reassigned me to runs that stayed west of Knoxville, down toward Chattanooga, and into Alabama. I took a significant pay cut because those routes were shorter and less demanding, but I didn't care. I've never been back to that stretch of Route 32. I've never driven past Miller's Gap again. And I've never forgotten that figure in my headlights, pointing toward that cave entrance with the moving lights inside. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through dark stretches of highway, I find myself checking my mirrors compulsively, looking for a silhouette that shouldn't be there, listening for footsteps that move too smoothly, watching for arms that are just a little too long. The Appalachian Mountains have been here for millions of years, some of the oldest mountains in the world. The Cherokee, the people who knew these lands before anyone else, they understood something that we've chosen to forget. That there are places in these hills where the old things still live, still watch, still wait, and they mark the people they want. I don't know why that thing pointed me toward that cave. I don't know what would have happened if I'd gotten out of my truck, if I'd walked over to that opening in the rock, but I know I made the right choice by running. And I know that whatever is in those hills around Miller's Gap, it's still there. Still standing in the road at dusk, still pointing toward those dark openings in the mountainside. I just hope I'm never unlucky enough to see it again.
Our next account comes from a park ranger who learned that some trails in the Tennessee Smokies aren't on any official map for very good reasons.
My name is Jessica, though when I worked for the National Park Service, they called me Jess. I'm 34 now, and I'm from Maryville, Tennessee, just a few miles from the entrance to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I grew up hiking those trails, and becoming a ranger had been my dream since I was a kid. I got the job when I was 25 and threw myself into it completely. I loved everything about it, the physical challenge, the solitude of the backcountry, the feeling of protecting one of the most beautiful places on Earth. The park gets millions of visitors every year, and most people never get far from the main attractions. Clingman's Dome, Cades Cove, Laurel Falls. The trail heads near Gatlinburg, but the Smokies cover over 800 square miles, and there are vast sections of wilderness where you can hike for days without seeing another person. That's the part I loved most. The deep backcountry where the forest feels ancient and untouched. This happened during my 4th year as a ranger. In late September of 2018, I was assigned to backcountry patrol, which meant hiking out to the remote campsites, checking on backpackers, looking for illegal camping or fire violations, and generally making sure people were safe and following the rules. It was the part of the job I enjoyed most, even though it meant spending nights alone in areas where the closest backup might be hours away. The Park Service had been getting reports of something unusual happening along a stretch of trail in the Cataloochee area, which is in the southeastern section of the park near the North Carolina border. Cataloochee is less visited than the main tourist areas, known mainly for its elk herd and some beautiful historic structures. The reports were vague, mostly from day hikers, who said they'd gotten disoriented or confused on the trails. A few people had reported feeling like they were being followed. One couple said they'd found a side trail that wasn't on their map and had followed it for a while before getting a bad feeling and turning back. My supervisor asked me to hike out there and take a look around. He framed it as a maintenance check, looking for downed trees or trail damage that might be confusing hikers. But I could tell he was a little concerned. The Smokies are crisscrossed with old trails, some dating back to before the park existed, and occasionally hikers would stumble onto these abandoned paths and get lost. It was part of my job to identify these and either mark them clearly as closed or block them off. I started my hike early on a Tuesday morning, which meant the trails were nearly empty. Cataloochee requires a long drive on a winding gravel road just to reach the valley, so it naturally filters out casual visitors. I parked at the Purchase Knob trailhead and started up the mountain, carrying enough supplies for 2 nights in the backcountry. The first day was perfect. Cool mountain air, brilliant sunshine filtering through the leaves, which were just starting to turn color. I saw a black bear from a safe distance, spooked a few wild turkeys, and made good time. By late afternoon, I'd reached the area where the reports had been concentrated, a section of trail that ran along a ridge between 2 valleys. I didn't see anything unusual at first. The trail was well maintained, clearly marked, and exactly where it should have been, according to my GPS and map. I hiked another mile, then started looking for a place to camp. There was a designated backcountry site about a 1/4 mile ahead, and I planned to spend the night there and continue my patrol in the morning. That's when I saw the junction. It was subtle, just a slight divergence where another trail split off from the main path. The split was almost invisible if you weren't looking for it, hidden behind a large oak tree and a thick stand of mountain laurel. There was no trail marker, no sign of any kind, but there was definitely a path there, worn smooth by use, winding down the slope into a hollow I couldn't see the bottom of. I stopped and pulled out my map. According to every official document I had, there was no trail junction at this location. The main trail should have continued straight along the ridge for another 2 miles before eventually descending. But here was this path, clear as day, leading off into the forest. I marked the location on my GPS and took some photos. Then I decided to investigate. It was only about 4 in the afternoon, still plenty of daylight, and this was exactly what I'd been sent to look for. If this was an old trail that needed to be closed off, I should document it and report back. I turned onto the side trail and started down into the hollow. The path was narrow but well defined. Someone or something had been using it regularly. The undergrowth was worn down and there was a clear line of travel, but something about it felt wrong immediately. The forest on either side seemed denser, the shadows deeper. The sounds changed too. The birdsong that had been constant all day faded until there was nothing but the sound of my boots on the trail and the wind in the trees. I hiked for about 15 minutes, descending steadily. The hollow grew narrower as I went, the slopes on either side rising steeply until I was walking through what felt like a crack in the mountain. The trees here were massive, old-growth chestnuts and oaks that must have somehow survived the blight that killed most of the chestnut trees in the region. A century ago, their canopy was so thick that the light took on a greenish, underwater quality. Then I came to the clearing. It opened up suddenly, a roughly circular space maybe 40 yards across. The ground was covered in moss and pine needles, and there were stones arranged in patterns I didn't immediately recognize. Not a fire ring or a cleared campsite. These stones were old, weathered, covered in lichen. They'd been there for a very long time. In the center of the clearing was a structure. At first glance, it looked like an old cabin, the kind built by settlers, or maybe a hunting shelter from decades past. But as I got closer, I could see it was stranger than that. The logs that made up its walls were huge, much larger than what you'd normally use for a cabin, and they'd been fitted together without nails or notches, just stacked and somehow locked in place. The roof was slate, not wood or tin, and it had survived whatever years or decades this structure had been sitting here. There was no door, just an opening about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, completely dark inside. I should have turned back right there. Every instinct I had was telling me this place was wrong, but I was a ranger, and part of my job was investigating exactly this kind of thing. Old structures in the park needed to be documented and either preserved or removed depending on their historical value. I needed to at least look inside and see what this was. I pulled out my flashlight and approached the opening. The beam of my flashlight pierced the darkness inside, revealing a single room. The floor was dirt, packed hard over time. The walls were bare logs, no furniture or decorations, but there were things scratched into the wood, marks and symbols that didn't look like any language I recognized. They covered every wall from floor to ceiling, layer upon layer of them, as if generations of people had added their own marks to what was already there. And hanging from the ceiling were bundles of herbs and plants, dried and dark with age, tied together with what looked like strips of bark. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam moving across the symbols. Some of them were geometric patterns, circles and triangles and spirals. Others looked almost like stick figures, human shapes with too many limbs or heads, positioned wrongly. And there were animal shapes too, deer and bears, and things I couldn't quite identify. The bundles of herbs swayed slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. As I watched them, I noticed that they were arranged in a pattern, hanging at specific points around the room in what might have been a circle. And directly beneath each bundle, carved into the dirt floor, were more symbols. I was so focused on documenting everything with my camera that I almost didn't notice when the light changed. The greenish daylight that had been coming through the doorway behind me was fading. Not gradually the way sunset fades, but rapidly, as if something was blocking the entrance. I turned around and felt my heart stop. There was someone standing in the doorway, or something. It had a human shape, but it was completely motionless, silhouetted against the dying light. I couldn't make out any features, just an outline, and it was tall. Much taller than any person should have been, its head nearly touching the top of the doorframe. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "I'm a park ranger. This is a routine inspection." The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there, blocking the only exit. I felt a cold fear building in my chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't a lost hiker, or even a hostile local. This was something else. I reached for my radio, intending to call for backup, even though I knew I was almost certainly out of range. But before I could key the mic, the figure moved. It didn't step into the cabin. It just shifted, tilting its head at an angle that was wrong, too far to the side, and I heard a sound. It was a voice, but not like any voice I'd ever heard. It spoke in multiple tones at once, high and low, male and female, young and old, all layered together. And it spoke in a language I didn't understand. Words that seemed to click and hiss and resonate in my chest. Then it started to laugh. The sound was horrible. That same multi-toned quality, dozens of voices laughing together, some high and shrieking, others low and rumbling. It filled the cabin and seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the symbols carved into the wood. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran straight at the doorway, at the figure, with my flashlight held in front of me like a weapon. The figure didn't stop me. As I got close, it simply stepped aside, or vanished or something. One moment, it was blocking the door, and the next moment, I was through the opening and running across the clearing toward the trail. I didn't look back. I hit the narrow path at a sprint and started climbing, my pack bouncing on my shoulders, my breath coming in gasps. The trail was steep and I was running uphill, but fear gave me energy I didn't know I had. Behind me, I could hear sounds. Footsteps, maybe, or something moving through the underbrush parallel to the trail, and that laugh, still echoing through the hollow, following me up the mountain. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. When I finally reached the junction where the side trail met the main trail, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, my legs shaking so badly I couldn't stand. I looked back down the trail I just climbed. There was nothing there. No figure, no sounds of pursuit, just the forest, peaceful and quiet in the fading daylight. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I needed to get out of those mountains immediately. I hiked through the night, using my headlamp, not caring about the regulation that said rangers should make camp at designated sites. I just wanted to be back at my truck, back on pavement, back in the world where things made sense. I reached my vehicle at dawn, exhausted and shaking. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, trying to process what had happened. Then I drove straight to the ranger station and requested an immediate meeting with my supervisor. I told him everything: the side trail, the clearing, the cabin with the symbols, and the figure in the doorway. I expected him to look at me like I was crazy, maybe suggest I take some time off. Instead, his expression got very serious, and he asked me to show him on a map exactly where I'd been. When I pointed out the location, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something I wasn't expecting. The area I'd been in, that particular hollow, had a history, a bad history. Back in the 1800s, before the park existed, there had been a settlement there. Not much, just a few families who'd lived in extreme isolation. The settlement had disappeared in the 1890s, just abandoned overnight, with no record of where the people went or why they left. The only thing that remained was some of the structures they'd built, including what sounded like the cabin I'd found. Over the years, there had been other incidents, hikers who'd found that same trail and reported strange experiences, feelings of being watched, voices in the woods, symbols carved into trees. A few people had disappeared in that area over the decades, though those disappearances had been officially attributed to getting lost in the wilderness. My supervisor told me that the Park Service knew about the place, but had made a decision years ago not to publicize it or officially close the trail. The thinking was that marking it as forbidden would only attract curiosity seekers and thrill hunters. Instead, they'd simply removed it from all maps and hoped that the remote location and difficult access would keep most people away. But every few years, someone found it anyway. He asked me if I wanted to file an official report. I said yes. He told me that report would be classified and kept in a restricted file that only senior Park Service personnel could access. It wouldn't become part of the public record. Then he told me I was being reassigned to visitor center duty for the rest of the season. No more backcountry patrols, no more overnight camping in remote areas. He framed it as standard procedure after a traumatic experience, but I could tell there was more to it. He didn't want me going back out there. I didn't argue. The truth is, I didn't want to go back either. I worked at the visitor center for the next 8 months, answering questions about bear safety and the best trails for families with kids. It was mind-numbing work for someone who'd loved the solitude of the backcountry, but I didn't complain. Every night, I went home to my apartment in Maryville, and every night, I was grateful to be sleeping in a bed with walls around me and locks on the doors. The following spring, I put in my resignation. I told them I was pursuing other opportunities, which was true in the sense that I was pursuing any opportunity that would get me out of those mountains. I moved to Nashville and got a job with the state park system, working in areas that were more developed, more visited, more normal. I've never been back to Cataloochee. I've never hiked that section of the Smokies again. And I've never told anyone except my supervisor the full story of what I saw in that hollow. But sometimes I think about that cabin with the symbols carved into every surface. I think about those bundles hanging from the ceiling, swaying in a breeze that didn't exist. And I think about that figure in the doorway, impossibly tall, its head tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck, speaking in voices that came from everywhere and nowhere. The Cherokee have a word, Nunahi, which refers to spirit people who live in the mountains. They're said to be immortal, neither good nor evil, but dangerous to humans who stumble into their domain. The old-timers in those mountain communities, the ones whose families have been there for generations, they know other names for the things that live in the deep hollows. They have stories about settlements that vanished, about people who went into the mountains and came back, changed, and about places where the rules of the normal world don't quite apply. I don't know what I encountered in that hollow. I don't know if it was one of the Nunahi or something else, or something that doesn't have a name in any language we know. But I know it was real, and I know it's still there, in that clearing, in that cabin, covered in ancient symbols. The Park Service knows about it. They've known for a long time, but they can't close the entire forest, and they can't stop people from hiking into places they're not supposed to go. So the trail remains on no map. The cabin sits in its clearing, surrounded by those stone patterns, and every few years, someone finds it. I just hope whoever finds it next has the sense to run when they see that figure in the doorway. And I hope they're fast enough to make it back to the world where things still make sense. Because once you've seen what's out there in those hidden places, you understand something that tourists with their cameras and hiking poles will never know. The Smoky Mountains are beautiful, yes, but they're old. Older than our towns and roads and national parks. And in the places where people rarely go, in the deep hollows and forgotten valleys, things still live that were there long before us, and they're still watching.
This next story comes from a truck driver who took a detour through the back roads of Cumberland County and discovered why the locals never stop at a certain crossroads after dark.
My name is Liam. I'm 42, and I've been driving trucks for almost 20 years. I'm originally from Memphis, but my roots have taken me all over the South and Midwest. I've driven through every kind of weather, every kind of road condition, and I've seen my share of strange things on the highway. When you're out there at 3 in the morning on some empty stretch of interstate, your mind can play tricks on you. I learned early on not to let the isolation get to me, not to read too much into shadows or sounds. Most of the time, there's a logical explanation for the weird things you see. But what happened to me in November of 2019 doesn't have a logical explanation. At least not one I've been able to figure out. I was hauling a load of automotive parts from Nashville to Knoxville, a route I'd driven probably 100 times. It's a straight shot on I-40, about 3 hours if traffic is good. But that night, there was an accident just east of Cookeville. A bad one. Multiple vehicles, and the highway was completely shut down with no estimate on when it would reopen. I pulled off at the exit just before the backup started and checked my phone for alternate routes. The GPS suggested I could cut north on some county roads through Cumberland County, then angle back east toward Crossville, and eventually rejoin I-40. It would add maybe an hour to my trip, but that was better than sitting in standstill traffic for who knew how long. So I took the exit and headed north on Highway 70, then turned onto a smaller state route that wound through rural farmland and forest. This was around 10:30 at night, and traffic was non-existent. I was the only vehicle on the road. The route took me through a series of small communities, places so small they barely rated names. A few houses, a church, maybe a gas station. The kind of places that emptied out after dark, where the only lights were the occasional farmhouse window or a security light over a barn. About 40 minutes into the detour, I came to a crossroads that wasn't marked on my GPS. The road I was on continued straight, but there was another road crossing it at a perfect right angle. Old asphalt, cracked and patched with faded yellow paint. There was a stop sign for the crossing road, but not for the route I was on. As I approached the intersection, my headlights swept across something on the side of the road. A small building, or what was left of one. It looked like it had been a gas station decades ago. The old pumps were still standing, though they were clearly non-functional, just rusted metal shells. The building itself was falling apart, its roof partially collapsed, its windows broken out, and there was a figure standing in front of it. I saw it in my headlights for just a moment as I passed through the intersection. A person, or the shape of a person, standing perfectly still in front of the ruined gas station. They were too far from the road and too shadowed for me to make out any details, just a silhouette. I glanced in my side mirror as I continued past, and the figure was still there, still motionless. Something about it bothered me, though I couldn't say exactly what. Maybe it was just the isolation of the location, or the lateness of the hour. Who stands outside a ruined building in the middle of nowhere at 11 o'clock at night? I continued on, following the road as it wound through forest. According to my GPS, I should have reached another town in about 15 minutes, a slightly larger community called Crab Orchard. From there, I could get back onto a main highway. But 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 30, and I didn't reach any town. The road just kept going, winding through dark forest, with no houses, no intersections, no signs of human habitation at all. I checked my GPS and saw that it was confused. The little blue dot that represented my truck kept jumping around on the screen, placing me in different locations that didn't match where I knew I was. Then, it lost signal entirely. I wasn't too worried yet. GPS could be unreliable in mountain areas, and I knew I was generally heading in the right direction. As long as I kept moving, I'd eventually hit a town or a highway. Tennessee isn't that big, but another 20 minutes passed, and the forest just kept going. The road wound and twisted, climbing and descending hills, but it never reached anything. No houses, no side roads, no signs. Just endless dark trees pressing in on both sides. I checked my odometer. I'd driven almost 40 miles since that crossroads with the ruined gas station, which didn't make sense. The road I'd been on shouldn't have gone more than 10 or 15 miles before reaching another town. That's when I started to feel the first real edge of concern. Not panic, not yet, but a definite unease. Something was wrong with where I was. I considered turning around, but the road was narrow with no good place to turn a truck around. I'd have to back up or find a wider spot. I decided to keep going for a few more miles and see if I could find a place to turn. Then I came around a curve and saw the crossroads again. It was impossible, but there it was. The same intersection, the same stop sign for the crossing road, the same ruined gas station on the side of the road. My headlights swept across the front of the building, and there was the figure, still standing in the same spot, still perfectly motionless. I hit the brakes, bringing the truck to a stop in the middle of the intersection. I sat there, staring at that silhouette, trying to understand what was happening. I had driven in a straight line for almost an hour. I hadn't made any turns. There was no way I should have come back to the same crossroads. But here I was, and there was that figure, standing exactly where it had been before. I reached for my CB radio and keyed the mic. "Breaker, breaker, this is southbound hauler on County Road 77 near Crossville. Does anyone copy?" Static. We tried again with the same result. Either I was out of range of any other truckers, or my radio had decided to malfunction at the worst possible time. I looked back at the figure. It still hadn't moved, but now that I was stopped and had time to really look at it, I could see more details. It was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, and thin, too thin, like someone who'd been starved for months. Its arms hung at its sides, but they seemed too long, reaching past where its knees should have been, and its head had a shape that wasn't quite right, too elongated, or maybe just held at an angle that made it look wrong. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, to drive away from this crossroads and keep driving until I hit civilization. But if I drove forward, would I just end up back here again? Then the figure moved. It didn't walk toward me. It just raised one of those two long arms and pointed directly at me, or at my truck, or maybe at the road behind me. I made my decision. I put the truck in gear and turned right, taking the crossing road, the one I hadn't taken before. If forward and backward both led to this place, maybe a different direction would break whatever loop I was caught in. The crossing road was even narrower than the one I'd been on, barely wide enough for my truck. Trees hung over it from both sides, their branches creating a tunnel. My headlights seemed dimmer here, not reaching as far, as if the darkness was thicker. I drove carefully, watching for any obstacles. The road climbed steeply up the side of a ridge, switchbacking several times. In my mirrors, I could still see the glow of the ruined gas station behind me, that figure still standing in front of it, though I was getting further away with each second. Then, the road leveled out, and I came to another intersection, 4 roads meeting at a crossroads, and in each of the 4 corners there was a building, or what was left of buildings. One was the gas station, the same one I'd just left. Same rusted pumps, same collapsed roof, same broken windows. The second was an old church. Small, white, with a steeple that leaned at a dangerous angle. Its door hung open, revealing darkness inside. The third was a house. 2 stories made of wood that had weathered to gray. Every window was dark. And the fourth was something I couldn't quite identify. It might have been a store or maybe a small factory. Its roof was gone entirely, leaving just 4 walls and empty windows like eye sockets. And in front of each building, standing perfectly still, was a figure. 4 of them, each identical to the first one I'd seen, tall and too thin and wrong. They stood facing the intersection, facing my truck, all perfectly motionless. I felt my breath catch in my throat. This was impossible. This couldn't be real. But my hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I needed to get out of here, away from this place, away from these things, back to the normal world where crossroads were just crossroads, and abandoned buildings were just abandoned buildings. I turned left, taking a third direction, and pressed the accelerator harder than I should have. The truck lurched forward and I sped away from that intersection, watching in my mirrors as the 4 figures grew smaller and smaller behind me. This road descended steeply, and I had to brake constantly to keep from going too fast. The forest was thick on both sides, so thick that my headlights barely penetrated it, and in that darkness, I started seeing more figures. They stood between the trees, just inside the tree line, motionless and watching. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Every few yards there was another one, standing silent and still, their 2 long arms at their sides, their 2 long faces pointed toward the road. I kept driving, my foot heavy on the gas every time the grade allowed it. The figures just kept coming, an endless line of them on both sides of the road, all watching as I passed. Then, the road turned sharply, and I almost didn't make the curve. I had to brake hard, the truck's tires squealing, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to go off the road into that forest full of watching things. But I held the curve, and when I straightened out, I saw something ahead that made me almost sob with relief. Lights. Real lights. Electric lights from buildings and street lights and vehicle headlights. A town, a real town with cars and gas stations and people. I pressed harder on the gas and watched those lights get closer. The forest on both sides of the road was still full of figures, but I didn't care anymore. I just needed to reach those lights, reach civilization, reach safety. The town came up fast. A sign at the edge said, "Crab Orchard, Pop 815. I'd made it. Somehow I'd broken out of whatever that was and made it to where I was supposed to be. I pulled into the first gas station I saw and parked in a spot. I turned off the engine and just sat there, my hands trembling, my breath coming in gasps. Through the truck's windows, I could see normal things. A clerk inside the gas station, restocking shelves, a car at the pumps, a couple walking from the convenience store to their vehicle. Normal. Real. Safe. I looked at my clock. It was 12:47 a.m. I'd been on those roads for over 2 hours, but it had felt like much longer. I waited until my hands stopped shaking. Then I got out of the truck and went into the gas station. I needed to use the bathroom, and I needed to confirm that I was really back in the normal world. The clerk was a young guy, maybe 20, wearing a store uniform. He glanced up as I came in and gave me a nod. "Help you with anything?" "Just using the restroom," I said. My voice sounded hoarse. "Sure thing, back corner." I used the bathroom, then bought a coffee just to have an excuse to talk to someone. The clerk rang it up and I asked him, "Hey, is there a crossroads with an old gas station back that way?" I pointed vaguely in the direction I'd come from. His expression changed slightly. Not much, but enough that I noticed. "You mean Devil's Crossroads?" The name sent a chill through me. "Is that what it's called?" "That's what some folks call it," he said. "There's a few old abandoned buildings at a crossroads about 20 miles west of here. Used to be a little community way back, but everyone left decades ago." "Have you ever been there?" I asked. He shook his head quickly. "No, sir, and I wouldn't go there, especially not at night." "Why not?" He looked at me for a long moment, like he was deciding whether to say more. Finally he spoke, his voice lower. "People get lost on those roads. Sometimes they don't come back for hours, even though the roads aren't that long. And the ones who do come back, they tell stories about things they saw, things that don't make sense." "What kind of things?" "Figures standing by the buildings. Same figure in multiple places, like it can be in 2 spots at once. Roads that loop back on themselves. Forests full of things that look like people but ain't." He shrugged. "Most folks around here just avoid that area entirely. There's a reason those buildings are still standing even though they're falling apart. Nobody wants to go out there to tear them down." I thanked him and headed back to my truck, coffee in hand. Before I got in, I looked back west, toward the direction I'd come from. The road disappeared into darkness and forest, and I could almost convince myself that what I'd experienced had been fatigue or stress or some kind of hallucination. Almost, but I knew better. I'd been driving for 20 years, and I knew the difference between tired imagination and real experience. What I'd seen out there, those figures and that impossible crossroads and those endless roads, that had been real. I got back in my truck and pulled up my GPS. It had signal again, and it showed a clear route to Knoxville. I avoided any roads that would take me back west toward that crossroads, and instead drove north to I-40, even though it added time to my route. I made my delivery in Knoxville at dawn, then immediately drove back to Memphis. I told my dispatcher I was taking a few days off, and I spent that time trying to process what had happened. I did some research on that area, looking for any information about those crossroads. There wasn't much. A few mentions in local history books about a settlement called Black Oak that had existed in the late 1800s. It had been bypassed by the railroad and the main highways, and people had slowly moved away until nothing was left but empty buildings. The last residents had left sometime in the 1950s, but I also found some references in old newspapers and historical societies to strange occurrences in that area. People getting lost on roads they knew well. Hunters, reporting figures in the forest that would stand motionless for hours, a few disappearances that were never solved, and I found one other thing, a mention in a folklore collection about something the Cherokee had called the Crossroads people. According to the story, there were certain places where the world was thin, where the boundary between our reality and something else was weaker. Crossroads were often such places, and in these thin places, things could cross over. Things that looked almost human, but weren't. Things that watched and waited, and sometimes reached out to touch the people who stumbled into their domain. I don't know if that's what I encountered. I don't know if those figures were the Crossroads people or something else or just some phenomenon we don't have a name for. But I know I was caught in something out there on those roads, something that didn't follow the normal rules of space and distance. I still drive trucks. I still make runs all over the South, but I plan my routes very carefully now, and I avoid certain areas entirely. I won't drive through Cumberland County, especially at night, and if I see a crossroads with old abandoned buildings, I drive past it as fast as I can without stopping, because I know now that there are places in Tennessee, in those rural areas where the old roads still wind through ancient forests, where reality is thinner than it should be, where things wait at crossroads, standing motionless, watching for the people who take the wrong turn at the wrong time. And I know that if you find yourself on a road that loops back to the same place, if you see the same intersection no matter which direction you drive, you need to break the pattern. Take a different turn. Drive faster. Do whatever you have to do to get back to the normal world, because the alternative is to end up like the people who never came back from those roads, the ones whose vehicles were found abandoned, empty, with no sign of where the drivers went. I think about those figures sometimes standing in front of those ruined buildings. I think about how many of them there were, lining the forest on both sides of the road. And I wonder if maybe they were all the people who didn't make it out. All the ones who got lost on those roads over the years and decades and maybe centuries. Maybe when you get caught in a place like that, if you can't find your way back to reality, eventually you become part of it. You become one of those watchers standing motionless at the crossroads, waiting for the next traveler to stumble into the trap. I don't know if that's true. I hope it isn't. But I made it out, and I'm not going back to find out. The crossroads are still there. The buildings are still standing, and the figures are still waiting, standing in the same spots they've stood for who knows how long, watching the road for the next person who makes the wrong turn on a dark Tennessee night.
The next testimony comes from a graduate student researching Appalachian history, who found something in an old coal mine that the locals had been trying to keep hidden for generations.
I'm Sarah, I'm 29, and I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia. In 2017, I was a graduate student at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, working on my master's thesis in Appalachian studies. My research focused on the social and economic impacts of coal mining on small communities in East Tennessee during the early 20th century. It was fascinating work, digging through old company records, conducting oral histories with descendants of miners, and visiting the sites of abandoned mining operations. The Tennessee coal fields weren't as extensive or famous as those in Kentucky or West Virginia, but there had been significant mining in certain areas, particularly in Campbell, Anderson, and Morgan counties. Many of these mines had closed by the 1950s as the easily accessible coal ran out and the operations became economically unviable. The mines were sealed, the equipment removed, and the communities that had grown up around them either died out or transitioned to other industries. For my thesis, I wanted to focus on one particular mining community called Petros, which had been essentially a company town built by the Brushy Mountain Coal Company. The mine there had operated from the 1890s until 1911, when a disaster killed dozens of men and led to the mine's closure. The community had struggled on for a few more decades, but by the time I visited in 2017, Petros was mostly just a handful of houses and a historical marker. What made Petros interesting for my research was that the mine disaster in 1911 had never been fully explained. The official report blamed a methane explosion, which was common in coal mines of that era, but there were conflicting accounts from survivors and some odd details in the historical record that didn't quite add up. Several of the bodies were never recovered. The mine was sealed immediately afterward, which was unusual. Typically, recovery efforts would continue for some time, and in the months following the disaster, several miners who had survived refused to talk about what happened and a few left the area entirely despite having families and homes there. I thought there might be a story worth telling in those gaps, something about the human cost of mining and the way companies covered up safety failures. So in October of 2017, I drove out to Petros to do some field work. I planned to interview any remaining descendants of miners, take photos of the old mine site, and see if I could access any local records that might shed light on what really happened in 1911. Petros is in Morgan County, about an hour and a half northwest of Knoxville. The drive took me through beautiful mountain country, though the area had clearly seen better days economically. Old coal towns often had a certain haunted quality to them, places where you could still see the bones of what used to be. Abandoned railroad spurs, deteriorating company houses, overgrown slag heaps. When I arrived in Petros, I stopped at a small general store that also served as the community gathering place. There were a few men sitting outside, retired folks by the look of them, drinking coffee and talking. I introduced myself and explained that I was researching the old brushy mountain mine for my thesis. The conversation stopped. The men looked at each other, then back at me, their expressions suddenly guarded. One of them, an older man with a weathered face and sharp eyes, asked me, "What exactly are you planning to do?" "Just research," I said. "I'm looking at the 1911 disaster, trying to understand what happened and how it affected the community. I was hoping to interview people whose ancestors worked in the mine and maybe take a look at the old mine site, if it's accessible." "Mine's been sealed for over 100 years, another man said. "Nothing to see there but a hole in the mountain with bars over it." "I understand," I said, "but I'd still like to photograph the site, document where it is. It's important for the historical record." The first man, whose name I learned was Mr. Dockery, shook his head slowly. "Miss, I'm going to give you some advice. You seem like a nice young lady, and I'm sure your research is important. But that old mine, that's not a place you want to go poking around. Some things are sealed up for good reasons." I'd encountered this kind of resistance before in my research. Mining disasters were traumatic events, and communities didn't always like outsiders dredging up painful histories. I tried to reassure him that I would be respectful and sensitive in my work, but Mr. Dockery wasn't concerned about me being disrespectful. "It's not about hurt feelings," he said. "It's about safety. That mine's been sealed since 1911, and it needs to stay sealed. There's things down there that should stay buried." I assumed he was talking about structural dangers, maybe unstable tunnels or pockets of gas. "I'm not planning to go inside," I assured him. "Just to see the entrance and the general area." The men exchanged looks again, having some kind of silent conversation. Finally, Mr. Dockery sighed. "You're going to go whether we tell you not to or not, aren't you?" "I'd like to, yes," I said. "It's important for my research." "Then I'll tell you what my grandfather told me and what his father told him," Mr. Dockery said. "Don't go to that mine after dark. Don't go there alone. And if you hear anything from inside, anything at all, you leave immediately. Don't investigate. Don't try to record it. Just leave. You understand?" It was the kind of warning that sounded like folklore, the sort of superstition that grows up around disaster sites. But the seriousness in his voice made me nod. "I understand." He gave me directions to the mine site, which was about 3 miles outside of town, up an old access road. Then he added one more thing. My great-grandfather was in that mine in 1911. He was one of the ones who survived. He lived until 1963, and in all those years, he never once talked about what happened down there. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. Whatever he saw in that mine, it was bad enough that he took it to his grave. You remember that. I thanked him for the directions and the warnings, then drove out to find the mine site. The access road was overgrown but still passable with my car. It wound up the side of a mountain through thick forest that had reclaimed what had once been cleared land. I could see traces of the old mining operation, remnants of foundations where buildings had stood, rusted metal debris half buried in leaves, and the old rail bed where coal cars had run down to the processing facility. The mine entrance was exactly where Mr. Dockery had said it would be, set into the side of the mountain at the end of the access road. It had been thoroughly sealed with concrete and steel bars, exactly as the men had described. There was a state historical marker nearby, giving the basic facts. Brushy Mountain Coal Mine, operated 1893-1911, closed after a disaster that claimed 43 lives. 43. That was a significant death toll, even for the era when mining disasters were more common. I took photographs of the entrance, the marker, and the surrounding area. The forest had grown right up to the sealed entrance, and the whole area had a feeling of abandonment and decay. I was getting ready to leave when I noticed something odd. There were marks on the concrete seal, scratches, like someone had been trying to chip away at it. The scratches were fresh. I could see bright concrete beneath the weathered surface. Someone had been here recently with tools trying to break through the seal. I took close-up photos of the marks, wondering who would try to open a sealed mine and why. Treasure hunters, maybe, or thrill seekers. It wasn't my concern, really, but it was interesting. I spent the rest of the afternoon in Petros, conducting interviews with a few residents who were willing to talk to me. Most of them were descended from miners, but none had first-hand knowledge of the 1911 disaster. The few stories they had were vague and contradictory. Some said the explosion had been caused by the company's negligence. Others mentioned strange sounds that had been heard in the mine in the days before the disaster. One elderly woman told me that her grandmother had said the mine had gone bad, whatever that meant. By the time I finished my interviews, it was getting late. The sun was setting, and I faced a decision. I could drive back to Knoxville that evening, or I could find a motel nearby and continue my research in the morning. There were a few more people I wanted to interview, and I hadn't yet been able to access any company records that might be stored locally. I decided to stay. I found a small motel in nearby Wartburg and checked in for the night. I had dinner at a local diner, then returned to my motel room to review my notes and photos. I was looking through the close-ups of the mine entrance when something caught my eye. In one of the photos, in the darkness beyond the steel bars of the sealed entrance, there was something that looked like a reflection. 2 small points of light, maybe 20 feet back from the entrance, at about the height where a person's eyes would be. I zoomed in on the image. The points of light were definitely there, and they had a slightly greenish tint. They looked like eyeshine, the reflection you get when you photograph an animal at night and your flash catches their eyes. But I hadn't used a flash. It had still been afternoon when I took these photos, and there was plenty of natural light. I told myself it was probably just some reflection off moisture or minerals in the tunnel. Or maybe an animal had gotten into the mine somehow, despite the seal. But something about those 2 points of light bothered me. I spent an hour doing some more research online, looking for additional information about the Brushy Mountain mine disaster. I found a few newspaper articles from 1911, all reporting basically the same story. Methane explosion, 43 dead, mine sealed. But I also found something interesting in the archives of a regional historical society. There was a letter written in 1912 by a miner who had survived the disaster. He'd written it to the state mining inspector, complaining that the official report was incorrect. According to this miner, whose name was Henry Kellerman, the disaster hadn't been caused by a methane explosion at all. He claimed that the miners had broken through into a natural cavern system, something that wasn't on any of the company maps. And there had been something in those caverns, something that had attacked the miners. The letter was only a single page, and it ended abruptly. There was a note from the Historical Society saying that Kellerman had left Tennessee shortly after writing this letter, and his subsequent whereabouts were unknown. I read the letter several times. It sounded like the ravings of someone who'd been traumatized by a disaster and was looking for something to blame. Breaking into natural caverns wasn't uncommon in mining, and it could certainly cause disasters if the caverns contained gas or were structurally unstable. But something that had attacked the miners? That sounded like trauma-induced fantasy. Still, it was interesting. It gave me a slightly different angle for my thesis, a look at how survivors of mining disasters sometimes created alternative narratives to cope with what they had experienced. I should have left it at that. I should have driven back to Knoxville in the morning, written my thesis using the interviews and historical records I'd gathered, and never thought about that mine again. But I didn't. I made a decision that I've regretted every day since. I decided to go back to the mine that night. My reasoning was simple. If there was an animal in there, I wanted to photograph it. If I could get a clear image of whatever had caused that eyeshine in my earlier photo, it would be interesting documentation. And yes, I was curious about those fresh scratches on the seal. Maybe someone was trying to reopen the mine illegally, and that was worth documenting too. I told myself I was just going to look. I wasn't going to try to get inside. I would take some photos with my good camera and flash, see if I could capture whatever I'd seen in the earlier image, and then leave. I waited until around 11 p.m. when the motel was quiet. I got in my car and drove back to Petros, then up the access road to the mine entrance. I parked and grabbed my camera and flashlight. The forest at night was different from the forest during the day. The darkness was thick, and my flashlight beam seemed to barely cut through it. The sounds were different too. Insects, the wind in the trees, and occasionally sounds I couldn't identify. Strange clicks and rustles that might have been animals or might have been branches settling. I reached the mine entrance and set up my camera on a tripod. The steel bars were spaced about 8 inches apart, wide enough that I could stick my camera lens between them and get a clear shot of the interior tunnel. I took several photos with the flash, the bright light momentarily illuminating the tunnel. In between flashes, the darkness inside the mine was absolute. My eyes couldn't penetrate it at all. I was reviewing the photos on my camera's screen when I heard it, a sound from inside the mine, faint but distinct, a scraping sound like something being dragged across stone. I froze, my finger hovering over the camera's button. The sound came again, a little louder. Definitely a scraping sound, rhythmic, as if something was being pulled slowly through the tunnel toward the entrance. I remembered Mr. Dockery's warning, if you hear anything from inside, leave immediately. I should have listened. God, I should have listened. But I was a researcher, and this was exactly the kind of thing I needed to document. If there was something in the mine, an animal, or a person, or even just falling rocks, I should record it. I turned on my camera's video mode and aimed it through the bars into the darkness. The camera had a night vision setting, and I switched it on. The screen showed the tunnel in shades of green and black, the night vision illuminating far more than my eyes or flashlight could. The tunnel extended back into the mountain, its walls rough-hewn and shored up with old timbers. About 30 feet in, the tunnel bent to the left and disappeared from view. The scraping sound continued, getting closer, and then I saw movement at that bend in the tunnel. Something was coming around the corner, something big. At first I thought it was a bear. The shape was large and moving on all fours. But as it got closer, I realized it wasn't a bear. The proportions were wrong. It had 4 limbs, but they bent at angles that didn't match any animal I knew. And it was pulling something behind it, dragging it across the stone floor, which explained the scraping sound. My hands started shaking, but I kept the camera steady, kept recording. The thing continued moving toward the entrance, toward me, getting close enough that the night vision picked up details. It had skin that looked pale and hairless in the green night vision. Its limbs were long and multi-jointed, like an insect's legs, but thicker and covered in that pale skin. Its body was bulky and misshapen, and its head... I couldn't process what I was seeing. It had a head that was too large, too elongated, with a mouth that was just a dark opening, lined with what might have been teeth. Behind it, being dragged by one of those terrible limbs, was what looked like a bundle of old clothes. But as the thing got closer, I realized it wasn't clothes. It was a body, a human body, ancient and desiccated, wearing rotted mining gear. The thing was maybe 15 feet from the entrance when it suddenly stopped. Its head lifted, that dark mouth opening wider, and I could see down its throat, see that it went back further than should have been possible, see movement deep inside it. Then it looked directly at the camera, directly at me. I don't know how I knew it was looking at me. It didn't have eyes, at least not that I could see. But there was an awareness in the way it oriented toward the entrance. Toward the camera lens sticking through the bars, it dropped the body it had been dragging and started moving toward the entrance faster, much faster. That scuttling, impossible gait bringing it toward the steel bars, toward me. I finally broke. I grabbed the camera off the tripod and ran. I ran through that dark forest, my flashlight bouncing wildly, tree branches whipping at my face. Behind me, I could hear sounds from the mine entrance, metal scraping on metal, the bars rattling, and a sound that might have been breathing or might have been something else, something wet and rasping that no animal should make. I made it to my car, threw the camera into the passenger seat, and started the engine with shaking hands. I drove down that access road far too fast, nearly going off the edge twice on the hairpin turns. But I didn't slow down until I reached the main highway. I drove straight back to Knoxville. I didn't stop at the motel to get my things. I didn't stop for anything. I just drove, checking my rearview mirror constantly, expecting to see something following me in the darkness. When I got back to my apartment, I locked every door and window. Then I transferred the video from my camera to my laptop. I watched it 3 times, and each viewing confirmed what I'd seen. That thing in the tunnel, that impossible thing, and the body it had been dragging, wearing mining clothes from over a century ago. I spent the rest of the night researching everything I could find about the brushy mountain mine disaster. I found more letters in various historical archives, more accounts from survivors who'd broken, their silence years later, and a pattern emerged. The miners had broken into a natural cavern system, just as Henry Kellerman had said, but they'd also released something. Multiple survivors mentioned pale things that had come boiling out of the caverns, things that could move in the darkness, things that had attacked the miners. The methane explosion had been real, but it had been deliberately set, a desperate attempt to seal the mine and trap those things inside. 43 men had died. Most had been killed by the things from the caverns. The explosion had buried them, along with the things, under thousands of tons of collapsed rock and earth. The few survivors had gotten out and helped seal the mine from the outside, using concrete and steel to make sure nothing could ever get out. But the things weren't dead. They couldn't die, or they lived too long for human lifespans to matter. They were still down there, in the darkness under the mountain. And at least one of them was close to the entrance, close to the seal. Those fresh scratches I'd seen on the concrete. Those weren't made from the outside. They were made from the inside, or that thing was trying to get out. I didn't sleep for 3 days. I kept thinking about that creature, about its impossible anatomy, about the way it had looked at the camera. And I kept thinking about the body it had been dragging. Was it one of the miners from 1911? Had that thing been keeping the body for over 100 years? I eventually went to my thesis advisor and told him I was changing my research focus. I couldn't explain why without sounding insane. So I just said I'd discovered the Brushy Mountain story was less interesting than I'd thought and wanted to work on something else. He was disappointed, but accepted my decision. I ended up writing my thesis about Appalachian folk music traditions, a much safer topic. I still have the video. I've never shown it to anyone. Who would believe it? They'd think it was fake, some kind of elaborate hoax or editing trick. And maybe that's for the best. Because if people knew what was really sealed in that mine, they might do something stupid. They might try to open it. I think about those fresh scratches on the seal. I think about how old those things might be, how long they've been in those caverns under the mountains. And I think about the fact that the seal, strong as it is, won't last forever. Eventually, the concrete will crack, the steel will rust, and when it does, those things will come out. The people of Petros know. They've known for generations. That's why they warned me. That's why they wanted the mine to stay sealed and forgotten. I left Tennessee after I finished my degree. I moved back to Virginia, as far from those mountains as I could get while staying on the East Coast. I got a job teaching at a community college, and I never mentioned my aborted research on the Brushy Mountain mine. But I still check the news from Morgan County sometimes, looking for stories about strange things being seen in the forests around Petros, looking for reports of people going missing, looking for any sign that the seal has finally failed. So far, it's held, but I know it won't hold forever. Those things have been underground for millions of years, maybe. They were there before humans, before mammals, maybe before life came onto land. And they'll be there after we're gone too, unless they get out. I hope the seal holds for a long time. I hope whatever ancestors of the Petros residents are still there 100 years from now remember to keep watch on that mine. Keep it sealed, keep people away, because what's inside can't be killed. It can only be contained. And if those things ever do get out, if they ever make it past that concrete and steel barrier, they'll come boiling out of that mine just like they did in 1911, pale and hungry and ancient, looking for prey in a world they once dominated. I've never gone back to that mine. I never will. And if you're reading this, if you're ever near Petros, Tennessee, and you're curious about that old sealed mine entrance, please listen to me. Stay away. Don't investigate. Don't try to open it. Don't even get close, because the things inside are waiting. They've been waiting for over 100 years, and they're patient. They have all the time in the world.
The following story comes from a woman who inherited her grandmother's house in the mountains and discovered why 3 generations of her family had refused to enter one room.
My name is Rachel. I'm 36 years old, and I'm originally from Johnson City, Tennessee. The story I'm about to tell you happened 2 years ago, in the summer of 2023. It involves my grandmother's house, a place I'd visited countless times as a child, but never really understood until I became its owner. My grandmother, Helen, lived her entire adult life in a small house on the outskirts of a town called Mountain City, up in the northeast corner of Tennessee near the Virginia border. It's beautiful country up there, all rolling mountains and dense forests, with small communities scattered through the valleys. The house itself was old, built sometime in the 1920s, a 2-story farmhouse with white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch. I have good memories of that house from my childhood, long summers spent exploring the woods around it, helping my grandmother in her garden, sitting on the porch in the evenings, listening to her tell stories about the old days. She was a strong woman, my grandmother. Practical and no nonsense. Not the type to believe in superstitions or let fear guide her decisions. But there was one room in that house that we were never allowed to enter. It was on the second floor, at the end of the hallway. Just a normal door, painted white like all the others. But it stayed locked, always. When I was a kid and asked about it, my grandmother would just say it was storage, full of old things that weren't safe for children to be around. As I got older and the question came up again, she'd change the subject or find a reason to leave the room. My mother, Helen's daughter, never talked about it either. The few times I tried to bring it up with her, she'd get a strange expression on her face and tell me to respect my grandmother's privacy. It was clear that whatever was in that room, or whatever the story behind it wasn't something the women in my family wanted to discuss. When I was in college, I spent a summer living with my grandmother. I was between apartments and needed a place to stay, and she welcomed me happily. By that point, I was old enough that the locked room didn't really interest me anymore. It was just a quirk of the house, something I'd gotten used to. But I do remember one incident that should have made me more curious. I came home late one night and found my grandmother standing in the hallway outside the locked room. She was just standing there in her nightgown, staring at the door, and she didn't notice me until I called her name. When she turned to look at me, her face was pale and her eyes were wet, like she'd been crying. "Are you okay, Grandma?" I asked. She wiped her eyes quickly. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just remembering things. Old things." "What kind of things?" She shook her head. "Nothing you need to worry about. Go to bed now. It's late." I didn't push it. I've regretted that over the years. Maybe if I'd asked more questions then, I would have been better prepared for what I eventually discovered. My grandmother died in March of 2023. She was 92 and had been in declining health for about a year. Her death wasn't a surprise, and she went peacefully in her sleep, which was a mercy. At the funeral, I learned that she'd left the house to me. Not to my mother, which I found strange, but to me specifically. My mother explained it to me after the service. She wanted you to have it. She said you were strong enough. That was all she would say about it, and when I tried to ask what she meant, she just shook her head and walked away. So I inherited the house. I was living in Knoxville at the time, working as a freelance graphic designer, and the idea of moving back to Mountain City wasn't initially appealing. It was remote, far from the kind of city amenities I'd gotten used to. But the house was paid off, and I was paying too much for my apartment in Knoxville. From a practical standpoint, it made sense. I moved in at the end of June. It took several weekends to clean out my grandmother's belongings, sort through decades of accumulated possessions, and make the house feel like mine rather than hers. My mother helped a little, but she seemed uncomfortable being there, always finding excuses to leave early. Throughout all of this, the locked room stayed locked. My grandmother's key ring had dozens of keys, and I tried them all on that door, but none of them fit. It was an old-style lock, the kind that required a skeleton key. Eventually, I decided I'd have to call a locksmith to either open it or replace the lock entirely. But I put it off. There was always something else to do, some other part of the house that needed attention. And truthfully, I think part of me was reluctant to open that door. The years of mystery, my grandmother's odd behavior, my mother's discomfort, all of it had built up a sense that whatever was behind that door was something significant. It was late July when things started happening. I woke up one night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking very carefully. I lay in bed, listening, my heart pounding. The footsteps moved down the hall, paused, then moved back and forth, pacing. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, convinced there was an intruder in the house. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher while 2 sheriff's deputies drove out to check the house. They searched every room, every closet, the attic, the basement. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No evidence anyone had been in the house, except me. One of the deputies asked about the locked room. I explained that it had belonged to my grandmother, and I hadn't gotten around to opening it yet. He tried the handle, found it locked, and suggested I get it open soon. Closed spaces can sometimes harbor animals or mold, he said. Best to know what you're dealing with. After they left, I sat in the kitchen drinking tea and trying to calm down. I'd heard those footsteps. They'd been real. But if no one was in the house, what had I heard? The sounds continued over the next several nights. Always the same pattern. Footsteps in the hallway, pacing back and forth, stopping outside the locked room. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked, though I knew logically that wouldn't help if there really was an intruder. On the 4th night, I decided to investigate. When I heard the footsteps start, I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife and opened my bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, clear as day, moving right in front of me. I could hear the floor creaking under weight that wasn't there. I watched the hallway, my flashlight beam illuminating nothing but empty space, while the sounds continued. Then they stopped. Right outside the locked room, I stood there, frozen, my light aimed at that door, and I heard something else. A voice, muffled, like it was coming from inside the room. A woman's voice, singing something I couldn't quite make out. I don't remember making the decision to move, but I found myself walking toward that door. I put my ear against it and listened. The singing was clearer now, though I still couldn't understand the words. It was an old song, something that sounded like a lullaby or a hymn. The voice was soft and sad, and it made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. I tried the handle again, knowing it would be locked, but feeling compelled to try anyway. It didn't budge. "Who's in there?" I called through the door. The singing stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Then I heard my grandmother's voice, clear as if she was standing right next to me. "Don't open it, Rachel. Please don't open it." I jerked away from the door so fast I nearly fell. I stumbled back to my room, locked the door, and didn't come out until morning. The next day, I called my mother. I told her everything. The footsteps, the singing, my grandmother's voice. She was silent for a long time after I finished. "Mom," I said, "are you still there?" "I'm here," she said, quietly. "I was afraid of this." "Afraid of what?" "Rachel, there's something I need to tell you. Something Grandma made me promise never to tell you, unless you heard it yourself." What she told me took over an hour, and by the time she finished, I felt like I was seeing my family history in a completely different light. The locked room had been my great-grandmother's room. Her name was Sarah, and she'd lived in that house with my grandmother and grandfather back in the 1960s. Sarah had been a young woman when she moved there, newly married, and by all accounts, a happy and vibrant person. But something had happened to her in that house. Over the course of several months, she'd changed, become withdrawn, fearful, talking about things she saw and heard that no one else could perceive. She claimed there was something in the house, something old and wrong, something that had been there long before the house was built. My grandmother, who was more practical and less superstitious, thought Sarah was having some kind of mental breakdown, but things kept happening that couldn't be explained. objects moving on their own, sounds in the night. And Sarah's behavior became more and more erratic. One night, Sarah locked herself in her room and wouldn't come out. She was screaming about something trying to get in. My grandmother and grandfather tried to break down the door, but it wouldn't budge, as if something was holding it shut from the inside. The screaming eventually stopped. When they finally got the door open the next morning, Sarah was gone. The room was empty. The window was locked from the inside. There was no way out. They searched for weeks. The police investigated, thinking maybe my grandfather had done something to her, but there was no evidence of foul play. Sarah had simply vanished from a locked room. And then, a few weeks later, my grandmother heard her, singing in that room, the same lullaby she used to sing. My grandmother locked the door and never opened it again. She heard Sarah sometimes over the years, pacing in there, singing, sometimes crying. But she never went in, and she never let anyone else in either. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked my mother when she finished. "Because Grandma didn't want you to be afraid of the house. She loved that house, despite what happened. And she hoped that maybe when she died, it would stop. That Sarah would finally be at peace." But it hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. I spent the next several days researching the history of the property. The house had been built in 1924, but there had been other structures on the land before that. A much older cabin, dating back to the early 1800s, had stood on this same spot. That cabin had burned down in 1922, killing the family that lived there. But the land itself had an even older history. The Cherokee had considered this area sacred, or possibly cursed. There were references in old records to a place they called the Singing Ground, where the barrier between the living world and the spirit world was thin. I found a mention in a local history book of settlers in the area reporting strange phenomena, voices in the woods, figures that appeared and disappeared, time seeming to move differently in certain places. Several people had vanished over the years, disappearing without a trace from homes and camps. The more I learned, the less I wanted to stay in that house. But something kept me there. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was a feeling that running away wouldn't solve anything. The house was mine now, and whatever was in that room, it was my responsibility. I made a decision. I was going to open that door and see what was inside. Not because I wanted to, but because the uncertainty was worse than any truth I might find. I called a locksmith, one from Johnson City, who didn't know me or my family. He came out on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at the lock. "This is an antique," he said. "I can open it, but I'll probably damage the lock. You sure you want to do this?" I was sure. It took him about 20 minutes to drill out the old lock. When the door finally swung open, I felt my stomach drop. The room was empty. Completely, totally empty. No furniture, no boxes of storage, nothing. Just bare floors, bare walls, and a window that looked out over the backyard. But it wasn't right. Something about the room felt wrong. The proportions seemed off, like the walls weren't quite square. And the temperature was different, noticeably colder than the rest of the house despite the July heat. The locksmith finished his work and left, declining my offer of tea with an expression that suggested he was uncomfortable. I stood in the doorway of the open room, trying to decide what to do next. That night, I heard my great-grandmother again. But this time, she wasn't singing. She was screaming. The sound came from the room, loud enough to wake me from a dead sleep. I ran into the hallway and found the door wide open, even though I'd closed it before bed. The screaming was coming from inside, But the room was still empty. As I watched, something began to happen. The empty space in the room was changing. The walls seemed to recede, the room growing larger, deeper, stretching back into dimensions that shouldn't exist. And in that impossible depth, I could see movement. Figures. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all women, all pacing or standing or sitting in that vast, dark space. Some of them I could see clearly, their faces etched with fear or sadness. Others were faint, like shadows, barely there at all. And in the center of them all was my great-grandmother Sarah. She looked exactly like she did in the one photo I'd seen of her, young and beautiful, wearing the dress she'd disappeared in. She was screaming, and her mouth moved, but the sound was coming from everywhere, from the walls themselves. I stumbled backward, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing, but I couldn't look away. Sarah's eyes found mine, and I knew, in that moment, what had happened to her. She'd been taken, pulled into whatever thin place existed in this spot, into whatever space between worlds this room opened onto. And she'd been there for 60 years, trapped with all the other women who'd vanished from this place over the decades and centuries. She stopped screaming. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. "Don't let it take you too." Then she reached out, her hand stretching toward me across that impossible distance, and I felt something grab onto me. Not physically, but something deeper. Something that wanted to pull me into that space with her, to add me to that collection of lost women. I ran. I ran down the stairs, out the front door, into the yard. I didn't stop until I was at my car, fumbling with my keys, with shaking hands. I got in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from that house, from that room, from whatever was in there waiting to take me. I ended up at a motel in Boone, North Carolina, about an hour away. I checked in and sat on the bed, trying to stop shaking, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. My phone rang. It was my mother. "Did you open it?" she asked without preamble. "Yes." "And?" I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Your grandmother saw it too," she finally said. "Once, when your grandfather was still alive. She told me about it before she died. Said she opened the door one night and saw Sarah in there, along with all the others. That's when she knew Sarah wasn't coming back. That's when she locked it and decided it would stay locked forever." "What is it?" I asked. "What's happening in that room?" "I don't know." Grandma didn't know either, but she believed that the land, that particular spot, was a doorway. To where, she couldn't say, but women who got too close could get pulled through. It had happened before, to other families. That's why so many of the old houses in that area were abandoned or torn down. Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she burn the house down or sell it? Because she thought if she did, it would just move to another house, another family. At least here, she could keep watch. Keep people away from that room. Keep it contained. "I can't go back there," I said. "I can't live in that house, knowing what's in there." "No," my mother agreed. "You can't. But you can't sell it either. Can't let some unsuspecting family move in." So that's where things stand. The house is still there, still standing on that piece of land in Mountain City. I've hired someone to maintain it, to keep it locked and secure. I've spread rumors that it's structurally unsound, contaminated with mold, whatever I can think of to keep people away. The locksmith I hired replaced the lock on that room. A heavy deadbolt that can't be easily opened. I mailed him the key and told him to destroy it. I still own the property. I pay the taxes on it every year. But I've never gone back, and I never will. Sometimes I think about having the house torn down, but I'm afraid that would make things worse. At least now it's contained. That room is locked, and as long as it stays locked, whatever is in there can't reach out into the rest of the world. I've done research on the other women who vanished from that area over the years. There are records going back to the early 1800s. Women who disappeared from locked rooms, from houses and cabins, always without explanation. Always in that same general area, within a few miles of where my grandmother's house stands. I found something else, too. A Cherokee legend about a place in those mountains where the spirits of dead women could be heard singing. The legend said that sometimes the living would hear those songs and follow them, drawn by curiosity or sadness. And if they got too close, they'd cross over into the world of the dead and never return. I think my great-grandmother heard those songs. I think that's what she was hearing in those months before she vanished. And I think she got too close to that doorway, and it pulled her through. The singing ground. That's what the Cherokee called it. And my grandmother's house was built right on top of it. I live in Asheville now, North Carolina, far enough from Mountain City that I can sleep at night. But sometimes I still hear singing in my dreams. Old songs, lullabies, hymns. And I wake up terrified that I'm back in that house, standing in front of that door, feeling something, reaching out from the darkness to pull me in. I think about my great-grandmother, Sarah, trapped in that space for over 60 years. I think about all the other women in there with her, some of them probably centuries old by now. And I wonder if they're aware of where they are, if they suffer, or if they're caught in some kind of frozen moment, always experiencing the terror of being taken. I don't have answers. All I have is a house I can't sell and can't destroy, sitting on a piece of land that's been taking women for longer than anyone can remember. If you ever find yourself in Mountain City, Tennessee, and someone offers to show you a beautiful old farmhouse with a wraparound porch, don't go. If you hear singing in the mountains, in the woods, in places where there shouldn't be any voices, don't follow it. And if you ever find yourself in a house with a room that's always locked, a room that no one talks about, a room that feels wrong somehow, leave. Immediately. Don't ask questions. Don't investigate. Just leave. Because some doors should never be opened. And some places should never be disturbed. The singing ground is still there, the doorway is still open, and it's still hungry.
This account comes from an emergency medical technician who responded to a call deep in the Smoky Mountains and found something that wasn't in any training manual.
My name is Oliver. I'm 45 years old, and I worked as an EMT in Sevier County, Tennessee for almost 15 years. I'm originally from Pigeon Forge, grew up in the shadow of the Smokies, and thought I knew these mountains pretty well. I'd hiked most of the major trails, camped in the backcountry, and through my work as an EMT, I'd been to some pretty remote areas responding to emergencies, mountain rescues, lost hikers, heart attacks at remote cabins, that kind of thing. In all those years, I thought I'd seen just about everything these mountains could throw at someone. But in September of 2020, I responded to a call that showed me I was wrong. It started on a Wednesday evening around 7 p.m. I was working the late shift with my partner, a guy named Mike, who'd been an EMT even longer than I had. We were at the station in Gatlinburg when we got a call about a medical emergency at a remote cabin. The dispatcher gave us coordinates rather than an address, which usually meant we were heading somewhere really isolated. The coordinates led us to a location about 25 miles outside of Gatlinburg, deep in the national forest. Not technically in the park, but on private land that bordered it. The road got progressively worse as we drove, going from paved highway to gravel to barely more than a dirt track. Our ambulance wasn't really designed for this kind of terrain, and we had to take it slow to avoid damaging the vehicle or getting stuck. It took us almost an hour to reach the location. By the time we arrived, it was dark, and we were relying on our GPS and the ambulance's headlights to navigate. The cabin, when we finally found it, was more substantial than I'd expected. 2 stories, relatively new construction, with solar panels on the roof, and a modern look. Someone had money, and they'd chosen to spend it on privacy. There were 2 vehicles parked outside, a Range Rover and a pickup truck. Lights were on in the cabin, and as we pulled up, a man came out onto the porch. He was maybe 60, gray-haired, wearing expensive outdoor clothing. He looked scared. "Thank God you're here," he called out as we grabbed our equipment. "It's my wife. Something's wrong with her. I don't know how to describe it." Mike and I exchanged glances. Something wrong could mean anything from a heart attack to a panic attack to 100 other conditions. We followed the man into the cabin, carrying our kits. The interior was beautiful. High ceilings, modern furniture, a massive stone fireplace. Definitely an expensive retreat. But there was something odd about it. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and there were what looked like salt lines along the windowsills and doorways. I noticed these details peripherally, but my focus was on the patient. The man led us upstairs to a bedroom. His wife was lying on the bed, and at first glance she looked like she was asleep. She was maybe 55, well-dressed, peaceful-looking. But when we got closer, I could see that something was very wrong. She was breathing, but barely. Maybe 4 breaths a minute, which was dangerously low. Her skin was cold to the touch, her pulse weak and thready. But the strangest thing was her eyes. They were partly open, and they were moving. Not like REM sleep, but deliberately, as if she was looking at things, following something around the room. "How long has she been like this?" Mike asked, checking her vital signs. "About 3 hours," the husband said. "We were having dinner and she just stopped. Mid-sentence. She set down her fork, lay down on the couch, and closed her eyes. I thought maybe she was feeling sick, so I carried her up here. But she won't wake up, and she's been getting colder." "Has she taken any medications?" I asked. "Any history of seizures or neurological issues?" "No, nothing. She's healthy, or she was." Mike and I ran through our standard protocols. We checked her blood sugar, her pupils, her responses to painful stimuli. Nothing. She was deeply unresponsive, but not quite in a coma. It was like she was trapped somewhere between sleep and consciousness. "We need to transport her to the hospital," Mike said. "This is beyond our scope. She needs imaging, blood work, a full workup." The husband nodded. "Whatever it takes. I'll follow you in my car." We were getting ready to move her onto our stretcher when she spoke. It wasn't her voice. I mean, it came from her mouth, but the voice was different. Deeper, with an odd quality like there were multiple people speaking at once, and she spoke without opening her eyes, without any change in her expression. "You shouldn't have come here." We all froze. Mike's hand was still on her wrist, checking her pulse. "Ma'am," Mike said. "Can you hear me?" "She can't hear you," the voice said. "She's gone walking, and you shouldn't have disturbed this place." The husband made a sound like a sob. "What are you? Where is my wife?" The woman's eyes stopped moving and fixed on a point on the ceiling. Her mouth opened wider, and the voice came out louder. She heard the calling, she followed the paths, and now she's in the deep places, where the old things still remember. I'd been an EMT for years, and I'd dealt with psychiatric emergencies, people on drugs, people in various states of crisis. This felt different. There was something about that voice, those words, that made my skin crawl. Mike, ever the professional, tried to continue the assessment. "Ma'am, we're paramedics. We're here to help you. I need you to open your eyes and look at me." The woman's head turned. Her eyes were still mostly closed, but she was looking directly at Mike now. "Help? You don't understand what's happening. She's not here anymore. She chose to leave." "Leave where?" the husband demanded. "Where is she?" "The trails that aren't on your maps. The places between." She heard them calling, the old voices, and she was curious. So curious. And now she's seeing what shouldn't be seen. The temperature in the room had dropped. I could see my breath misting in the air. The lights flickered. "We need to go," I said quietly to Mike. "Right now." Mike nodded. We'd dealt with strange situations before, but this was beyond anything in our training. We started to lift the woman onto our stretcher, and that's when she grabbed Mike's wrist. Her grip was impossibly strong. Mike gasped and tried to pull away, but she held on. Her eyes opened fully for the first time, and they were wrong. The pupils were too large, taking up almost the entire eye, and they reflected the light like an animal's eyes. "Don't take her," the voice said. "She's walking the hidden paths. If you move her body, she won't be able to find her way back." "Let go of me," Mike said, his voice strained. The husband was backing toward the door, his face pale. "What the hell is happening?" The woman released Mike's wrist suddenly and turned her head toward her husband. "You brought her here, to this place. You didn't know. How could you know? The land remembers things. The mountains keep secrets, and some places, the boundary is thin." Then she started to convulse. It wasn't like a normal seizure. Her body arched upward, lifting completely off the bed, and she hung there suspended for several seconds before slamming back down. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, and a sound came out that wasn't human. It was like wind howling through a cave, or maybe voices screaming from a great distance. Mike and I did what we were trained to do. We secured her airway, checked her vitals, prepared to intubate if necessary, but her body temperature was still dropping. She felt like ice under my hands. "We're taking her," Mike said firmly. "Whatever this is, she needs a hospital. Now." We got her onto the stretcher and started carrying her downstairs. The husband followed, still asking questions we couldn't answer. As we moved through the cabin, I noticed more of those odd details. Symbols drawn on the walls in what looked like chalk. Bundles of herbs hanging from the ceiling, and books, lots of books, spread out on the dining table. Old books with weathered covers. We got her loaded into the ambulance, and I climbed in the back with her while Mike got behind the wheel. The husband said he'd follow us to the hospital. As Mike started the engine, I strapped myself in and prepared for a difficult transport. The woman's eyes opened again. That strange multiple voice came out quieter now. "The trails go deep, so deep, and she's so far along them now. Might not find her way back, might never." "What trails?" I asked, against my better judgment. "What are you talking about?" "The ones the Cherokee knew. The ones your people tried to forget. Paths that lead to the underneath places, where the old things live, where time moves differently. She walked them freely, her spirit did, and now it's lost in the spaces between breaths." The ambulance hit a rough patch of road and bounced violently. In the back, equipment rattled in its compartments. The woman's head lolled to the side, and she looked directly at me with those wrong eyes. "You've driven these roads many times. You think you know these mountains. But you know nothing. There are places here older than your species, older than the trees, older than the stone, and they're not empty." I didn't respond. I focused on monitoring her vitals, which were continuing to deteriorate. Her breathing was getting shallower, her pulse weaker. If this continued, she'd need intubation soon. We'd been driving for maybe 10 minutes when she spoke again. "Stop." "We're not stopping," I called up to Mike. "She needs the hospital." "Stop." The voice was louder now, filling the ambulance. "Stop the vehicle, now!" Mike glanced at me in the rearview mirror. I shook my head. We weren't stopping. The woman's body went rigid, every muscle locked, and she made that sound again, that howling, wind-screaming voices sound. The lights in the ambulance flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness, lit only by the glow of the equipment monitors. "Mike, what's happening?" I yelled. "I don't know. Everything just died." The ambulance coasted to a stop in the middle of the narrow forest road. Mike tried the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. We sat there in darkness, and I could hear my own breathing and the faint beep of the battery-powered monitors. Then I heard something outside, footsteps, lots of them, moving around the ambulance in a circle. I looked out the small window in the back door and saw figures. They were moving around us, walking in a slow circle. I couldn't make out details in the darkness, just shapes. But there were dozens of them, and they moved in perfect unison. "Oliver?" Mike's voice was shaking. "What the hell is out there?" "I don't know." "Just stay in the cab. Lock your doors." The woman on the stretcher suddenly sat up. The straps we'd secured her with snapped like they were made of paper. She turned to face me, and in the dim light from the monitors, I could see that her face had changed. The features were still hers, but the expression was alien, and her mouth was stretched into a too-wide smile. "They've come for her," the voice said. "The walkers, the ones who never left the paths. They recognize one of their own." "What are they?" I asked, my hand on the door handle, ready to run if necessary. "Spirits, people, things that used to be people, all mixed together. They've been on the trails so long they forgot how to be anything else, and they want her to join them, to walk forever in the underneath places." The figures outside pressed closer to the ambulance. I could see them more clearly now through the windows. They looked like people, but wrong. Their proportions were off, their movements too smooth, their faces too blank. And they were all reaching toward the ambulance, dozens of hands pressing against the metal sides. The woman lay back down on the stretcher. When she spoke again, it was in her own voice, weak and confused. "James? Where am I? What's happening?" I leaned forward. "Ma'am? Can you hear me? Do you know your name?" "Sarah. My name is Sarah. I was walking. There were paths in the forest, beautiful paths, and I followed them. But I got lost. I've been lost for so long. You're in an ambulance. We're taking you to the hospital. You're going to be okay." Her hand found mine and gripped it weakly. "No, not okay. I saw things, the underneath places, the old things that live there. They wanted me to stay, to keep walking their paths forever. But I found my way back. I heard James calling me, and I followed his voice." The figures outside suddenly stopped moving. They stood still for a moment, then began to move away, walking back into the forest in that same synchronized manner. Within seconds, they were gone. The ambulance lights came back on. Mike tried the engine, and it started immediately. "Let's go," he said, "right now, before anything else happens." We drove as fast as we dared on that terrible road. Sarah lay quietly on the stretcher, her eyes closed, her breathing slowly returning to normal. Her skin was warming up, her vitals stabilizing. Whatever had been happening to her was reversing. By the time we reached the hospital, she was fully conscious and talking normally. The doctors examined her thoroughly and couldn't find anything wrong. No stroke, no seizure activity, no drugs in her system. Nothing to explain what had happened. Her husband arrived about an hour after we did. I heard him telling the doctors that they'd only been at the cabin for 2 days, that it was a vacation rental they'd found online. He said Sarah had been fascinated by the forest around the cabin, had been taking long walks during the day. On the evening she collapsed, she'd mentioned seeing beautiful trails, paths that wound through the trees and seemed to go on forever. The doctors kept her overnight for observation, but she was fine, completely normal. She didn't remember much of what happened, just fragments, walking in the forest, following paths, seeing figures that might have been people or might have been something else. Mike and I filed our report, and went back to the station. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. What would we say? That we'd witnessed some kind of possession or spiritual experience? That figures had surrounded our ambulance in the forest? Who would believe us? But I couldn't let it go. A few days later, on my day off, I drove back out to that cabin. The coordinates were in our call log, and I wanted to see it again in daylight, wanted to understand what had happened. The cabin was empty when I arrived. No cars, no signs of occupancy. I walked around the property looking at those symbols that had been drawn on the walls, those bundles of herbs. Someone who'd been there before the couple rented it had been trying to protect the place, or maybe protect themselves from it. I walked into the forest behind the cabin, looking for the paths Sarah had mentioned. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just normal forest, thick undergrowth, no clear trails. But then I noticed something, a gap in the trees, a space that seemed a little too perfect, too intentional. I walked toward it and found a path. It was narrow and overgrown, but definitely a path, winding deeper into the forest. I followed it for maybe 100 yards. The trees on either side grew closer together, their branches forming a canopy overhead. The light took on a strange quality, greenish and dim, and I started to feel wrong, disoriented, like I was walking in a straight line, but somehow moving in circles. I heard voices, faint at first, then clearer. People talking, laughing, singing. But when I tried to focus on any specific voice, it would fade away. And I saw movement between the trees, figures that might have been people, moving parallel to the path, always just at the edge of my vision. I turned around and walked back the way I came, or tried to. The path seemed different now, winding in directions I didn't remember. I walked faster, then started to run, my heart pounding. I burst out of the forest into the clearing around the cabin, gasping for air. But when I looked back, I couldn't see where I'd come from. The tree line was unbroken, no gap, no path, just solid forest. I got in my car and drove away, and I've never been back. I did some research afterward. The land that cabin was built on had a history. There'd been a settlement there in the 1800s, a small community that had vanished in the 1850s. All the residents, about 40 people, had disappeared over the course of a single week. No bodies were ever found. No explanation was ever determined. The land had been considered cursed after that, and nobody lived on it for decades. The Cherokee had stories about the area too. They called it a breathing place, where the spirit world and the physical world overlapped. They believed that people could accidentally cross over if they weren't careful, could find themselves on paths that led to places humans weren't meant to go. I eventually quit my job as an EMT. Not immediately, but within a year of that call. I told myself it was burnout, that 15 years was long enough, that I needed a change. But the truth was I couldn't shake what I'd seen. Every time we got a call to a remote location, every time we drove through dark forest, I'd remember those figures circling the ambulance, remember Sarah's voice that wasn't her voice, remember the feeling of being lost on a path that shouldn't exist. I live in Nashville now, about as far from those mountains as I can get while staying in Tennessee. I work in hospital administration, safely indoors, no more emergency calls in the middle of the night. But sometimes I think about Sarah, and I wonder if she really came all the way back. She seemed normal when we left her at the hospital, seemed like herself, again. But she'd walked those paths, seen those underneath places. How do you come back from that completely unchanged? And I think about all the other people who might have followed those paths over the years. The Cherokee who knew to avoid them, the settlers who didn't. The people from that vanished community in the 1850s. Where did they go? Are they still walking those trails, trapped between worlds, unable to find their way back? The mountains are old. The Cherokee knew that, respected it, understood that there were places humans shouldn't go and things they shouldn't disturb. But we've forgotten most of that knowledge. We build cabins in those places. We hike those trails. We stumble onto paths that look inviting and safe. And sometimes, if the boundary is thin enough, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, You might find yourself walking into places that exist alongside our world, but separate from it. Places where the rules are different, where time moves strangely, where things that used to be human have forgotten how to be anything else. If you're ever in the Tennessee mountains, if you're hiking or camping or staying at some remote cabin, and you see a path that seems perfect, that winds beautifully through the trees, that calls to you somehow, don't take it. Don't follow it to see where it goes. Don't be curious about what might be at the end, because you might not find your way back. And even if you do, you might bring something with you, some knowledge or awareness that you were never meant to have, some understanding of the spaces between, the underneath places, the old paths that have been there longer than we can imagine. Sarah got lucky. She found her way back. But I remember those figures outside the ambulance, those walkers who'd been on the paths so long they forgot how to leave. And I wonder how many people, over how many years, have taken those trails and never returned. The paths are still there. They're always there, waiting in the old places, in the breathing places where the boundaries are thin. And they'll still be there long after we're gone, winding through forests that remember things we've chosen to forget.
Our next story comes from a forestry worker who took a job clearing trails in the Cherokee National Forest and discovered that some trails don't want to be cleared.
I'm Tom, 41 years old, from Chattanooga originally. In the spring of 2021, I took a job with a private contractor that did maintenance work for the U.S. Forest Service in the Cherokee National Forest. The pay was good, the work was outdoors, and I'd always enjoyed being in the mountains. It seemed like a perfect fit. The Cherokee National Forest covers over 650,000 acres in eastern Tennessee, spanning from the Georgia border up to the Smoky Mountains. It's beautiful country, with hundreds of miles of trails, numerous waterfalls, and vast stretches of wilderness. The Forest Service maintains the major trails and recreation areas, but there are also hundreds of miles of unofficial trails, old logging roads, and paths that date back to before the forest was federally protected. My job was to work on a crew that cleared and maintained these secondary trails. We'd get assigned a section of trail, usually in a remote area, and we'd spend several days out there cutting back overgrowth, repairing drainage, marking the route clearly so hikers wouldn't get lost. It was hard physical work, but I enjoyed it. The crew I worked with was good people, and there was something satisfying about taking an overgrown, barely passable trail and turning it into something safe and accessible. The incident I'm going to tell you about happened in June, about 3 months after I started the job. We got assigned to work on a section of trail in Unicoi County, in the northern part of the forest near the North Carolina border. The trail ran along a ridge for about 8 miles, connecting 2 different recreation areas. According to our supervisor, it hadn't been maintained in over 10 years and was reportedly in pretty bad shape. There were 4 of us on the crew. Me, a guy named Carlos, who'd been doing trail work for years, a younger guy named Ethan, who was fresh out of college and doing this as a summer job, and our crew lead, a woman named Beth, who'd worked for the Forest Service in various capacities for almost 20 years. We loaded up our gear and drove out to the trailhead on a Monday morning. The plan was to spend 5 days working our way along the trail, camping out each night, and doing as much clearing and repair as we could. The Forest Service would send someone to pick us up at the other end of the trail on Friday. The first 2 days went fine. The trail was overgrown, but not impossibly so. We worked our way along, cutting back rhododendron and mountain laurel, clearing fallen trees, repairing the trail tread where erosion had washed it out. We made good progress and set up camp each night at designated spots along the trail. On Wednesday morning, we reached a section of trail that was different from what we'd encountered so far. It was about mid-morning, and we'd been working for a couple of hours when Beth called us all together. She was standing on the trail looking at her map and her GPS unit, and she looked confused. "Something's not right," she said. "According to the map and GPS, the trail should continue straight ahead, following the ridge, but I'm not seeing any trail." We all looked. She was right. The trail we'd been following just stopped. The cleared path ended, and ahead of us was dense forest with no obvious route through it. "Maybe it's just really overgrown," Carlos suggested. "We've seen sections that were pretty bad." Beth shook her head. "No, this is different. When a trail gets overgrown, you can still see traces of it. The tread, the cut corridor through the trees. Here, there's nothing." She pulled out her physical map, the kind that's printed on waterproof paper and doesn't rely on batteries or satellite signals. We all gathered around to look. According to the map, the trail continued along the ridgeline for another 3 miles before starting its descent toward the other recreation area. It was marked as a standard hiking trail, nothing unusual about it. "Must be a map error," Ethan said. "Maybe the trail was rerouted at some point and the map wasn't updated." Beth didn't look convinced, but we didn't have a lot of options. "Let's spread out and see if we can find where the trail picks up again. It's got to be here somewhere." We fanned out, moving into the forest on either side of where the trail should have been. I worked my way upslope, looking for any sign of a cleared path or trail markers. That's when I found the sign. It was nailed to a tree about 50 yards from where the main trail ended. The sign was old, the wood weathered and gray, but the words painted on it were still clearly legible. "Trail closed. Do not enter." I called the others over. When Beth saw the sign, her expression darkened. "This isn't a Forest Service sign," she said. "Wrong format, wrong style. Someone else put this here." "Local landowners?" Carlos suggested. "Maybe there's a property dispute or something." "We're on federal land," Beth said. "There shouldn't be any private property along this section." "So, do we keep going?" I asked. Beth was silent for a long moment, studying the sign and the forest beyond it. Finally, she nodded. "Yeah, this is federal land, and we have authorization to maintain this trail. Some unauthorized sign doesn't change that, but everyone stay alert. If we run into actual property owners, we back off and contact the supervisor for clarification." We moved past the sign and into the forest. Within about 20 yards, we found the trail again. It was there, just as it should have been, a clear corridor through the trees, but it was in worse shape than anything we'd seen before. The trail tread was almost completely obscured by leaf litter and fallen branches. The vegetation on either side had grown inward, creating a tunnel-like effect. And it was quiet. I'd been working in the forest long enough to notice when the usual sounds were absent. No birdsong, no insects buzzing, no sound of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Just silence. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Ethan asked, his voice hushed. We all noticed. But there wasn't any obvious explanation for it, and we had work to do. We started clearing the trail, working our way forward slowly. The work was harder here. The vegetation seemed thicker, more resistant to our tools, and there were more fallen trees across the path, requiring us to cut through them with our chainsaws. Around noon, we stopped for lunch. We'd only managed to clear about a quarter mile of trail, much slower progress than we'd been making on the previous sections. "This is going to take longer than we thought," Beth said, looking at her map. "We might not finish this whole section by Friday." As we ate, I noticed something carved into the tree nearest to where we'd stopped. It looked like letters, but they were old and weathered, hard to make out. I walked over to get a closer look. "STOP," I read aloud. "Someone carved stop into this tree." The others came over to look. Below the word stop, there were more carvings, but these were harder to decipher. They might have been words in another language, or maybe just random marks. Cherokee, maybe, Carlos suggested. Could be, Beth said. Or early settlers. These mountains were logged pretty heavily in the early 1900s. Could be something from that era. We took photos of the carving and continued working. But the atmosphere was getting stranger. The silence persisted, and the forest around the trail felt wrong somehow. Too dense, too dark, even though it was midday and the sun was out. Around mid-afternoon, Carlos called out to us. He'd found something off the side of the trail, and he wanted us to see it. We gathered around him and looked at what he'd found. It was a cairn, a pile of stones stacked deliberately. But it wasn't like the cairns you sometimes see on trails, the ones hikers build to mark routes. This one was different. The stones were arranged in a specific pattern, and there were objects placed among them. Bits of bone, pieces of rusted metal, and what looked like very old glass bottles. "What the hell is this?" Ethan asked. "It's a marker," Beth said quietly. "A boundary marker, maybe, or a warning." "Warning about what?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but people don't build things like this without a reason." We took more photos and moved on, but I noticed Beth kept looking back at the cairn, her expression troubled. By the time we stopped for the day, we'd only cleared about 3/4 of a mile, way behind schedule. We set up camp at a flat spot just off the trail and made dinner. Nobody talked much. The silence of the forest and the strange things we'd found had put everyone on edge. I had first watched that night. We'd been rotating watch duty, one person staying awake for a few hours while the others slept, just as a safety precaution. Usually it was boring, just sitting by the fire and occasionally adding wood to keep it burning. But that night was different. I was sitting by the fire, about an hour into my watch, when I heard footsteps. They were coming from up the trail, from the direction we'd been heading. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking carefully in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, aiming the beam up the trail. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my light pointed into the darkness, but saw nothing. No person, no animal, nothing. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there?" No answer. But the temperature had dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath misting in the flashlight beam. I was about to wake the others when the footsteps started again, but this time they were coming from a different direction, from down the trail, from the way we'd come. I spun around, aiming my light the other way. Again, nothing. Just the trail disappearing into darkness. The footsteps continued, and now they seemed to be coming from multiple directions. All around the camp, moving in a circle, staying just outside the range of my flashlight. I woke Beth. She listened for a moment, her expression hardening. "Wake the others. Something's not right." We got Carlos and Ethan up, and the four of us stood by the fire, lights pointed in all directions. The footsteps continued their slow circle around our camp, never getting closer, never getting further away. "Animals?" Ethan suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "No," Beth said. "Animals don't move like that. And I've never heard of animals circling a camp with a fire. They'd run from the fire." "So what do we do?" I asked. "We wait, and we keep the fire burning. Whatever this is, it's not approaching. As long as it stays out there, we stay here." We stayed up the rest of the night, taking turns keeping watch and feeding the fire. The footsteps continued until about an hour before dawn, then stopped abruptly. As the sky began to lighten, the normal sounds of the forest returned. Birdsong, insects, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Whatever had been circling our camp was gone. "We should head back," Carlos said as we packed up our gear. "This is getting too weird." Beth shook her head. "We've got a job to do. and we're already halfway through this section. It would take just as long to go back as it would to push forward. Beth, I said, something followed us last night. Multiple somethings by the sound of it. That's not normal. I know it's not normal, she said, but we're professionals. We're trained to handle unexpected situations. We keep going, we finish the job, and then we can report everything we've experienced. I could tell she wasn't going to change her mind, and technically, she was the crew lead. We had to follow her decision. We kept working, pushing forward along the trail. The clearing work seemed to get harder with each passing hour. The vegetation was thick, and we kept finding obstacles. Fallen trees, washed out sections of trail, places where the route was completely obscured, and we kept finding more cairns. Every few hundred yards, there'd be another one, each slightly different in construction, but all clearly intentional. Some had bones, others had metal objects, a few had pieces of cloth tied to nearby branches. These are markers, Beth said after we'd found the fifth one. Someone marked this whole section of trail. They wanted people to know this area was, I don't know, special somehow, or dangerous. Who? Ethan asked. And when? Beth knelt down next to one of the cairns, examining the objects placed there. Could be Cherokee. They lived in these mountains for thousands of years before European settlement. Or could be early settlers. People who learned from the Cherokee. Either way, these are old. Really old. Around 3 in the afternoon, we reached another section where the trail completely disappeared. According to our GPS, we were standing right on it, but there was no visible path, just dense forest. This is ridiculous, Carlos said. It's like the trail keeps vanishing and reappearing. Beth pulled out her map again and studied it. Look at this, she said, pointing to a section of the map. See how the trail zigzags here? That's not normal. Most trails follow the natural contours of the land, taking the most efficient route. This section deliberately avoids something. Avoids what? I asked. She traced a circle on the map with her finger. There's a gap here. An area the trail goes around. About 100 acres with no trails, no roads, nothing. Maybe it's too steep, Ethan suggested. Or there's a cliff or something. Beth shook her head. The topographic lines don't show anything like that. It's just empty. Like whoever designed this trail deliberately avoided this whole area. So, what do we do? Carlos asked. Beth folded up the map and looked at the dense forest ahead of us. We follow the trail. If it avoids this area, there's probably a good reason. We spread out and eventually found where the trail picked up again, about 200 yards to the east. Just as Beth had said, it had zigzagged to avoid something, and now it was curving back to continue along the ridge. As we worked our way along this section, I started noticing something else. Trees with symbols carved into them. Not words, just geometric shapes. Circles, triangles, spirals. They were carved at about eye level, and they appeared at regular intervals, like markers. Look at these, I said, calling the others over. Beth examined the carvings. I've seen these before, in books about Appalachian folklore. These are protective symbols. People carved them to ward off, evil, I guess. Spirits, bad luck, whatever they believed threatened them. So someone walked through here carving protection symbols into trees, Carlos said. That's comforting. We pushed on, and the trail continued its strange zigzagging route, always seeming to avoid the area Beth had identified on the map. But around 4:30, we hit another problem. The trail led directly to a cliff edge. Not a small drop, but a serious cliff, maybe 80 feet high. And according to our GPS, the trail was supposed to continue straight ahead. That can't be right, Beth said, checking her GPS again. The map doesn't show any cliff here. We spread out along the cliff edge, looking for a way down or around. That's when Ethan called out, "I found something. Come look at this." He'd found a way down, not a trail exactly, but a series of ledges and handholds that someone had clearly used to descend the cliff. Whoever had come this way had even chiseled out some of the holds, creating a crude ladder carved into the rock face. "No way," Carlos said when he saw it. "I'm not climbing down that." "It's the only route," Beth said. "If we want to continue, we have to go down. Or we could admit this is a bad idea and turn back," Carlos replied. Beth looked at him for a long moment. "You want to spend another night in these woods? Walk all the way back, passing those cairns, that circle area, all of it? Or do you want to push forward and get out of here by tomorrow?" Put that way, going forward seemed like the better option, even if it meant climbing down a cliff face. We went slowly, one at a time, using ropes for safety. I went first, testing each handhold before committing my weight to it. It took almost an hour for all four of us to reach the bottom. When we regrouped at the base of the cliff, I looked up at what we'd just descended. From down here, it looked even more imposing. And I realized something else. The handholds had been carved from the bottom up, not the top down. Someone had climbed up this cliff, laboriously chiseling holds as they went. "Why would anyone do this?" I asked. "Why carve a route up this cliff when you could just go around?" "Because they needed to get up here fast," Beth said quietly. "They were running from something, and this was the quickest escape route." That thought hung in the air as we continued. The trail at the bottom of the cliff was in terrible shape, barely visible in places. But we pushed on, and by the time the sun started to set, we'd made it another mile or so. We set up camp for what we hoped would be our last night on this trail. Tomorrow, if we made good time, we'd reach the other recreation area and be done with this section. That night, we kept a double watch. 2 people awake at all times, both armed with flashlights and, in Beth's case, a flare gun she'd brought for emergencies. The footsteps started around midnight. Same as before, they circled our camp, staying just beyond the range of our lights. But this time, there were more of them. It sounded like dozens of people walking around us, their steps perfectly synchronized. And then we heard voices. They were faint and seemed to come from all directions at once. Speaking words I couldn't understand, in a language that sounded old and strange. Sometimes the voices would overlap, creating a sound like singing or chanting. "This is not natural," Carlos said, his voice shaking. "This is not animals or wind or any normal thing." Beth stood in the center of our camp, slowly turning to scan the darkness around us. "I know," she said. "Whatever this place is, whatever we're in the middle of, it's not happy we're here." "Then let's leave," Carlos said. "Right now. We pack up and we hike out in the dark." "And go where?" Beth asked. "Back the way we came? Climb up that cliff in the dark? Or forward, through territory we haven't scouted, with no idea what's ahead?" She was right. We were trapped. The safest option was to stay by our fire until daylight, then push forward as fast as we could. The footsteps and voices continued through the night. Several times, we saw movement at the edge of our firelight, shadows that looked human-shaped but moved wrong. Once, I was sure I saw a face looking at us from between the trees, pale and expressionless. But when I pointed my flashlight at it, there was nothing there. None of us slept. We just waited for dawn, feeding the fire, staying close together, trying not to think about what was out there in the darkness. When the sun finally came up and the sound stopped, we packed up camp in record time. Nobody talked about what we'd experienced. We just wanted to get out of there. We hiked fast, pushing ourselves harder than was probably safe. The trail was still in bad shape, but we didn't care about clearing it anymore. We just wanted to reach the other end, to get back to civilization, to put these woods behind us. Around mid-morning, we found something that made us all stop. It was a campsite, or what was left of one. There was a fire ring made of stones, the remnants of what might have been a tent, and scattered gear. But everything was old, weathered by years of exposure to the elements. Beth knelt down and picked up a metal canteen. It was rusted, but still intact, with initials carved into it. RMT 1987. 34 years, she said quietly. This camp has been here for 34 years. We spread out, looking at the rest of the gear. There was a backpack, its fabric rotted away, revealing a metal frame. A sleeping bag that had been torn apart by animals or weather, and boots. 2 pairs of boots, still laced up, positioned as if someone had just stepped out of them. "Where are the people?" Ethan asked. None of us answered, because the implications were too disturbing. This camp showed signs of being abandoned suddenly, gear left behind, no attempt to pack up or leave in an orderly fashion. And those boots, positioned like someone had vanished right out of them. "We need to keep moving," Beth said. "Right now." We didn't argue. We left the old camp behind and pushed forward with renewed urgency. Whatever had happened to those people in 1987, we didn't want it to happen to us. By early afternoon, we saw it. The other recreation area, visible through the trees ahead. We'd made it. We practically ran the last quarter mile, bursting out of the forest into the parking lot of the recreation area like we were being chased. There were a few vehicles in the lot, normal people doing normal things. Families having picnics, kids playing, people loading up kayaks. The contrast between this peaceful scene and what we'd just experienced in the forest was jarring. Our pickup vehicle wasn't scheduled to arrive until the next day, so we set up camp in the developed campground with bathrooms and water and other people around. We'd never been so happy to be in a crowded campground. That night, Beth made some calls. She contacted our supervisor and reported what we'd experienced, and she also contacted the Forest Service's law enforcement office about the abandoned camp we'd found. The next morning, before our ride arrived, 2 Forest Service rangers came to talk to us. They interviewed each of us separately, asking detailed questions about what we'd seen and heard on the trail. When they were done, one of the rangers, an older guy who looked like he'd worked in these mountains for decades, took Beth aside. I was close enough to overhear their conversation. "That section of trail," he said, "has been problematic for a long time. We don't publicize this, but there've been incidents there going back decades. People reporting strange experiences, feeling like they're being followed, hearing things, and disappearances. Nothing recent, but over the years, people have gone missing in that area." "What about the camp we found?" Beth asked. "From 1987? The ranger nodded. "I remember that case. 2 experienced hikers, a father and son. They set up camp and were never seen again. Their gear was found basically like you described. No bodies, no evidence of what happened to them. Just gone." "So what is it?" Beth asked. "What's in those woods?" The ranger was quiet for a long moment. "I've worked in these mountains for 35 years. I've seen things I can't explain. Places where the rules seem different, where things happen that don't make logical sense. The Cherokee knew about these places. They had specific areas they wouldn't go, boundaries they wouldn't cross. We've lost that knowledge, but the places themselves haven't changed." "Are you going to close that trail?" Beth asked. "Already closed," he said. "Has been for years, officially. We don't maintain it, don't mark it on current maps. People still find it sometimes, but we don't encourage it. That section you worked on? That was a mistake in the work order. Someone pulled up an old map that showed the trail as active. You weren't supposed to be sent there." Beth looked stunned. So we were clearing a trail that's officially closed? Afraid so, and based on your report, it's going to stay closed. We'll be putting up more prominent signage, maybe even physically blocking access. After our conversation with the rangers, our crew was picked up and driven back to our starting point. The drive took about 3 hours by road, a distance we'd hiked in 4 days. Nobody talked much during the drive. We were all processing what had happened, trying to reconcile our experiences with our understanding of how the world works. I worked 1 more week with that crew, finishing up a different section of trail in a completely normal part of the forest. Then I quit. I told myself it was because the pay wasn't that good, that I wanted something more stable. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about those woods, those footsteps, those voices in the dark. Beth left the job too, about a month later. Carlos transferred to a crew that only worked on developed trails near major recreation areas. I don't know what happened to Ethan. I've researched that area since then, looking for any information about what might be there. The Cherokee did have stories about certain places in those mountains being entrances to the spirit world, places where the boundary between physical and spiritual was thin. They performed specific rituals and followed specific rules when traveling through those areas. European settlers brought their own superstitions and fears, and some of them learned from the Cherokee to avoid certain places. But over time, that knowledge faded. We forgot which places were dangerous, which boundaries shouldn't be crossed. The Forest Service has records of disappearances in that area going back to the 1920s. Not a lot, maybe 1 every 10 years or so, but enough to establish a pattern. People who went into those woods and never came back out. I don't know what's in those woods. I don't know if the footsteps and voices were spirits or something else. I don't know what happened to the people who disappeared there, including that father and son in 1987. But I know this: there are places in the Tennessee mountains that we were never meant to go. Places that belonged to something else long before we arrived. And despite our maps and GPS units and modern equipment, we're not welcome there. That trail is officially closed now. The signs Beth mentioned were installed, more prominent and with clearer warnings. The Forest Service has no plans to maintain or reopen that section, but the forest is big and people are curious. Sooner or later, someone will find their way onto that trail again. They'll ignore the signs, thinking they know better, thinking the warnings are just liability, protection, or exaggeration. I hope they turn back when they see the first cairn. I hope they listen to the silence and understand it means something is wrong. I hope they don't camp in those woods, don't stay after dark, don't wait around to find out what walks there at night. Because whatever is in those woods, it's still there, still waiting, still marking its territory with cairns and protective symbols, still circling in the darkness. And it doesn't like visitors.
The next testimony comes from a long-haul trucker who took a shortcut through Monroe County and found himself on a road that led to a town that shouldn't exist.
My name is Catherine, but everyone calls me Kat. I'm 52 years old, and I've been driving commercial trucks for almost 30 years. I'm originally from Memphis, but my routes have taken me all over the South and Midwest. I've driven through every state east of the Mississippi, racked up over 2 million miles, and thought I knew every road and shortcut worth knowing. What happened to me in August of 2022 showed me I was wrong. I was hauling a load of furniture from a manufacturer in Mississippi up to a distributor in Knoxville. It was a familiar route, one I'd driven dozens of times. Usually, I'd take I-40 the whole way, but that night there was a massive accident near Nashville that had the interstate shut down indefinitely. I pulled off at an exit and checked my navigation apps, looking for an alternate route. The most efficient detour would take me through southern Middle Tennessee and into East Tennessee via some state highways. It would add about 2 hours to my trip, but that was better than sitting in standstill traffic for who knew how long. I set my GPS for the alternate route and got back on the road. This was around 11 p.m., and traffic was light once I got off the interstate. The state highways wound through rural areas, small towns that were already shut down for the night, long stretches of dark forest. I'd been driving for about an hour when my GPS started acting strange. The screen kept flickering, losing signal, then picking it back up. I wasn't too concerned. Cell coverage in rural areas could be spotty, but then it directed me to turn onto a road that looked less maintained than what I'd been on. The sign said State Route 413, which wasn't a number I recognized, but I trusted my GPS. The road was paved, at least initially, and it seemed to be heading in the right direction based on the compass on my dash. After a few miles, the pavement turned to rough asphalt, then to gravel. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong. State routes in Tennessee, even the minor ones, are usually paved their entire length. But I was committed now. The road was too narrow to turn around a full-size truck, and I'd have to back up for miles to reach a spot wide enough. So I kept going, figuring it would eventually connect to another paved road. The gravel road wound through dense forest, climbing into what felt like mountains, though I wasn't sure which range I was in. My GPS had completely lost signal now, showing only a blinking dot on a gray screen. I drove for maybe 20 minutes on that gravel road, my headlights cutting through darkness so complete it felt solid. No houses, no other vehicles, no signs of human activity at all. Then I came over a rise and saw lights ahead. A town, or what looked like one. Streetlights, building lights, the glow of civilization. I felt a wave of relief. I'd stop, ask for directions, maybe get some coffee, and figure out how to get back on track. As I drove into the town, though, I started to notice things that were off. The buildings looked old. Not historic old, but genuinely old, like they'd been built in the early 1900s and never updated. There were storefronts with hand-painted signs, houses with wraparound porches and gingerbread trim, and street lamps that looked like they used gas rather than electricity. But they were lit. Everything was lit. Lights in windows, street lights glowing, even what looked like an open diner on the main street. I drove slowly down the main street, looking for someone to ask for directions, but I didn't see anyone. No pedestrians, no other vehicles, no movement at all. I pulled my truck to a stop in front of the diner. Through the windows, I could see tables and chairs, a counter, even what looked like food on some of the plates, but no people. I sat there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Something about this place felt wrong, but I couldn't articulate exactly what. It was just too still, too quiet, like a movie set rather than a real town. I grabbed my flashlight and my phone, which had no signal, and climbed out of the truck. The air outside was cold, much colder than it should have been for August in Tennessee. I could see my breath misting in the glow of the streetlights. I walked to the diner door and tried the handle. It was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside, and a bell above the door jingled. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone here?" No response. The diner was exactly as it had looked from outside. Tables set for diners, food on plates, coffee in cups, but no people, and the food looked fresh, steaming even, as if it had just been served. I walked behind the counter and into the kitchen. Pots on the stove, still warm. Dishes in the sink. A calendar on the wall showing June 1952. I stood there staring at that calendar, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. This had to be some kind of historical reenactment site, or a museum, or something. I left the diner and walked down the main street, looking in other windows. A barber shop with chairs and mirrors and shaving equipment from another era. A general store with shelves stocked with products I didn't recognize, brands that probably hadn't existed for decades. A movie theater with a marquee advertising films I'd never heard of. And everywhere, that same sense of recent abandonment. Lights on, things in mid-use, as if everyone had just vanished moments before I arrived. I walked back to my truck and stood there trying to decide what to do. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to get back on that gravel road and drive, until I found my way back to the normal world. But I was also incredibly curious. This place, whatever it was extraordinary. When would I ever see something like this again? I decided to walk a little further, to explore the edges of the town and see how large it was. I stayed on the main street, which ran for maybe half a mile before the buildings ended and the forest began again. At the far end of town, I found a church. It was white with a tall steeple, and its doors stood open. Light spilled out from inside, and I could hear music. Organ music, playing a hymn I half recognized. I walked toward the church, drawn by the sound of something alive in this dead town. As I got closer, I could see inside. Pews filled with people, all facing the front where someone stood at a pulpit. The congregation was singing, their voices joining the organ in harmony. Relief flooded through me. People! I could ask them what this place was, get directions, understand what was happening. I climbed the steps to the church and walked through the open doors. The music continued, and I started to walk down the center aisle toward the front. That's when I noticed something was wrong. The people weren't moving. They stood in the pews, their mouths open as if singing, but they were completely still, frozen mid-gesture, mid-breath, and their eyes were all looking in the same direction, all focused on me. I stopped walking. The music continued, but the people didn't move. They just stood there, dozens of them, all staring at me with those fixed, unblinking eyes. I started backing away slowly. That's when one of them moved. It was a woman in the front pew. Her head turned to follow me, the movement jerky and wrong, like a puppet on strings. Her mouth was still open in that singing position, but no sound came from her. Just that horrible stare, from eyes that didn't blink. Then another person moved, then another. One by one, they all started turning to face me, their movements synchronized and unnatural. The music continued, that hymn playing on, but the people were silent. I ran out of that church down the main street back to my truck. Behind me, I could hear something. Footsteps, dozens of them, all moving in unison. Coming after me. I didn't look back. I jumped into my truck, started the engine, and drove. I didn't care which direction, just away from that town and those terrible frozen people who had started moving. I drove back the way I'd come, my headlights illuminating the gravel road. In my mirrors, I could see the town's lights receding behind me, and I could see shapes in the road following me. Those people from the church, running after my truck with that same jerky, wrong movement. I pressed the accelerator harder, pushing my truck as fast as I dared on that rough gravel road. The shapes fell behind, unable to keep up with the truck's speed. I drove for maybe 30 minutes, retracing my route through the dark forest. When I finally reached the paved state highway, the one I'd turned off of, I almost cried with relief. My GPS suddenly came back online, showing my position on familiar roads. I was in Monroe County, Tennessee, about 50 miles off my intended route. I drove until I reached a town I recognized, a real town with real people and 24-hour gas stations. Pulled into a truck stop, parked, and just sat there shaking for a long time. When I finally felt calm enough to function, I went inside and got coffee and asked the clerk about the road I'd been on. State Route 413, she said. Never heard of it. We don't have a 413 in this county. I insisted, describing where I'd turned off, but she was adamant. There was no such route. She pulled out a road atlas and showed me. The road I'd been on didn't exist on any map. I thanked her and went back to my truck. I checked my own maps, my GPS records, everything. The route I'd driven wasn't showing up anywhere. It was like it had never existed. But I'd been there. I'd seen that town, those buildings, those people in the church. It had been real. I completed my delivery to Knoxville, then drove straight back to Memphis. I told my dispatcher I needed some time off, personal reasons, and took a week away from the road. During that week, I did research. I looked for any mention of a town in Monroe County that had been abandoned or depopulated in the 1950s. I found something, but it wasn't what I expected. There had been a town, a small community called Laurel Springs, that had existed in that area in the early 1900s. It had been bypassed by the railroad and the major highways, and by the 1940s, most residents had moved away. The town was essentially abandoned by 1950. But here's the strange part. There were stories about Laurel Springs, local legends that had persisted even after the town died. People claimed the town hadn't really been abandoned. They said the residents had all vanished one night in 1952, disappeared mid-meal, mid-work, mid-life. When authorities investigated, they found a town full of lit lamps and warm stoves and set tables, but no people. The official explanation was that the remaining residents had finally given up and moved away, all around the same time. But the locals told different stories. They said the town had been taken, pulled into some other place, some space alongside our world, but separate from it. And they said that sometimes people still found their way there. Travelers who took the wrong turn, who ended up on roads that shouldn't exist, would find themselves in Laurel Springs as it was in 1952. Still lit, still occupied in some sense, still waiting. I don't know if what I experienced was the real Laurel Springs, or some echo of it, or something else entirely, but I know I was there. I saw it, and I saw those people, those frozen figures who started moving when I entered their church. I've never been back to that area of Tennessee. I plan my routes carefully now, avoid detours through unfamiliar rural areas, especially at night. And if my GPS ever directs me to a road that doesn't look right, I don't take it. Because there are places out there that exist in the gaps, in the spaces between the mapped and known world. Places that time forgot or that time trapped. And once you find your way there, you might not find your way back. Or worse, something from there might follow you back. I still drive trucks, still make my living on the road, but I'm more careful now. I trust my instincts more than my GPS. And if I ever see a town that looks too old, too perfect, too preserved from another era, I'll drive right past it without stopping. Because some places should stay lost, some roads should stay unmapped, and some towns should remain in whatever strange space they've slipped into, separate from our world. Laurel Springs is still out there, I'm sure of it. Still lit, still waiting, still full of those frozen people who move when they shouldn't be able to. And somewhere in Monroe County, there's still a gravel road that appears on no maps that leads to a town that officially doesn't exist. I pray I never find it again.
That brings us to the end of tonight's stories from the Tennessee Appalachians. 8 accounts from people who encountered something in these ancient mountains that they couldn't explain, something that stayed with them long after they left. These hills have witnessed human activity for thousands of years, layer upon layer of history, and not all of it has been peaceful. The Cherokee knew which places to avoid, which ridges and hollows harbored things that weren't meant for human eyes. Settlers learned those lessons the hard way, and their descendants passed down warnings that have faded with time, but never entirely disappeared. The old places are still out there, waiting in the deep forest, the forgotten valleys, the roads that wind through darkness, and they're not empty. They're inhabited by things that were there long before us and will remain long after we're gone. Memories that won't fade, spirits that won't rest, and presences that exist just beyond the edge of what we can understand. If these stories have taught us anything, it's that curiosity in these mountains can be dangerous, and some warnings should be heeded even when they seem like superstition. The Tennessee Appalachians are beautiful, but they're also ancient and unforgiving, and they keep their secrets well. Thank you for listening to Blacktop Files. Stay safe out there in those dark hollers.